So we'll call the meeting of the Special Investigative Committee to order. Today appearing before the committee is Mike Romero, the current CFO for the Oklahoma State Department of Health. Mr. Romero, thank you for being here today. If we could begin by you just introducing yourself as well as anyone else that you may have brought with you today.
Yes, my name is Michael Romero. I'm the current Chief Financial Officer of the Oklahoma State Department of Health, and I have brought my personal counsel, Peter Skimica, from the Andrews Davis Law Firm.
Very good. Counsel, thank you for being here as well. We appreciate that.
My pleasure, Mr. Chairman.
The first order of business will be to swear in the witness. Mr. Romero, do you affirm that your testimony will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth on pain and penalty of perjury?
Yes, I do.
Thank you very much. If you could just take a couple seconds to explain some of the documentation that you've brought before the committee, part of the subpoena that was issued, compelled documentation on a couple of areas. And before you do that, I'll just make quick note to the committee that Mr. Romero has provided a timeline which you should have at your desk, as well as an entire binder of information. Obviously, with the documentation being provided right before the meeting, we have not had time to distribute that. However, we will do that as soon as we possibly can, get that information to the members of the committee, and go forward from there. But Mr. Romero may reference that documentation from time to time, and that's perfectly okay, and we'll just make sure that members get that in a timely manner. So if you could just explain exactly what you've brought with you today.
Absolutely. I brought a timeline, so you all possess that. I began as the Chief Financial Officer in April of 2017, so the timeline that you've been provided commences there and ends at 10:30. So the timeline is for the period of the time that I took over the position to the time when the two executive leaders and others had resigned, right to that point. So it's kind of a background that allows some summary synopsis of events and activities, and the book that is related to that it has several tabs in it and a table of contents in the front. I imagine it won't be too difficult for members to be able to look at that and share that, and I apologize that I only had one for you, but we're working to try to get the right information that was readily available and that was relevant to today. There is a lot of documentation, and I'd like to thank the chairman for adjusting the scope of that subpoena so that we could work within it in a relatively short time frame. But I will refer to that. It actually directly ties to the timeline that you have. So the table of contents in there will match the timeline. And I'm hopeful that it will provide some context. And I have followed these hearings, and I know there's been previous testimony. So hopefully, and I've listened to the chairman explain, some of the important items. Obviously, looking for answers into things that have occurred and understanding them. So I'm hopeful that the factual timeline can help getting a background, and then maybe I can assist in filling in the information related to some of the items that maybe are still confusing about some of the things that have already been said in here.
Very good. Thank you for that explanation. Is the documentation, you mentioned the amended subpoena that was sent, the second subpoena that was sent, and it requested available documentation. Is the information that you provide to the committee all available at this time information?
No, sir. There is obviously, as the general counsel had stated for the Department of Health, there is a lot of information. It's a very large agency. There's a lot of communications and the like. So if we were just to stack up available information, it would be substantial. It would probably be well beyond the purview of our capabilities to go through it. For discussion's sake, these items are items, I think, related to questions that had been asked, items that were germane to the finances of the entity, as well as my interaction with others related to the finances and so on.
Very good. As was mentioned a couple minutes ago, you are here because of a second subpoena that was issued, I believe last Friday, that was issued. Can you explain kind of from your perspective, this committee had originally served a subpoena for a meeting earlier last week, or I believe Thursday of last week. Can you explain from your perspective and your position kind of the situation that surrounded you not appearing last Thursday as requested by the committee?
Absolutely, I can explain what I know about, and I appreciate the question, because I think the fact that I could not appear may have been misconstrued somewhat publicly. I'm very happy to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to explain these things and to be able to work with this committee. Those were matters, I think, that related to, timing and so forth, that the general counsel of the agency had made specific requests and the like, and I think the time frame was relatively short. I think it was about a 2-day time frame, which is rather difficult to compile these documents and develop a cogent analysis to be able to answer questions and so forth. So, I didn't feel that getting here today was unreasonable in light of the vast amount of information to go through and the level of complexity that it entails, as well as my ability to be able to provide answers about it that are relevant for this setting, that can provide enough information so that it can be understood.
Sure.
And Mr. Chairman, if I could add, just from a purely legal
Absolutely.
standpoint, the agency filed an objection to the subpoena pursuant to the rules of civil procedure regarding depositions and subpoenas. Once that objection is filed, then Mr. Romero could not appear until that objection was resolved. So we were abiding by the rules as we understand them for this committee, which mirror that of the Oklahoma Civil Procedure Code.
Duly noted. Thank you for that. Mr. Romero, as we've gone through this process of trying to get you here, have you at any point been directed by anyone in the agency to not appear before this committee?
No, sir.
So you have had no contact with anybody within the State Department of Health encouraging you or telling you that you would not appear before this committee at any point?
The only I think the only question related to that was probably from me more than anything, because of the sensitivity of a lot of issues related to the fact that there's currently another investigation. I am, as well as a CPA, I am an attorney also, and no, I mean, I've expressed concerns internally that the best route is the legal route, and so, to appear, I think we had a lot of discussion about, is it going to be by agreement? I know some folks have I think, appeared here by agreement, and in speaking with my attorney, I was just concerned about making sure that happened the right way. But nobody internally in the Department of Health said specifically you cannot appear. I'm sure that they had concerns about, how that type of relationship, given all the specific nuances and complexities related to other investigations, I could understand that. But nobody particularly said you cannot appear.
Okay, very good. Well, at this time, if you will start by going through, so that we don't take up time from the members' questioning period, if you will just start to detail for us, going through the timeline as well as any pertinent information that you would like to share up front, kind of go through that detailed timeline, and then we'll open it up to members for questioning. So you are recognized at this time to delve into that information.
Mr. Chairman, do you have a time limit on that recognition? Because I want to make sure I'm fluid with this process here.
I want to make sure that you're thorough. When we open up to the questioning period, each member will have 10 minutes for questioning. So, if you could make it as thorough but as brief as possible, but still get the information to the members, that would be appreciated. So you don't have a set time limit, but realize that we do have a large amount of time for questioning after that you can get into more specifics on.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, committee, for the opportunity to address you. I'm the current Chief Financial Officer of the Oklahoma State Department of Health. My name is Michael Romero. I am, as you heard me say previously, a certified public accountant. I am also an attorney in the state of Oklahoma. I got started in this position in April 17th of 2017, as you'll see on the timeline, and just kind of a brief summary background as we get into some of those details. I have experience as a chief financial officer, specifically spent a year as a municipal chief financial officer, spent approximately 4 years in industry as a chief financial officer for Brewer Carpet One and the Floor Trader here in Oklahoma City. They run a large shared service center here for multiple operations across 6 states. Spent about 10 years in private practice in various business consulting facets and issues and tax-related matters as well. Worked as a staff accountant and a budget analyst before that. So it's not my first time working around financial information and the complexities related thereto at times. So I started and as a person that has that sort of background, I initially determined to gather specific information to be able to perform the function as anybody that would handle that role responsibly would. So throughout the course of getting started at the health department, it's a fairly large agency. Of course, there are county health departments all over this state. The person that I directly reported to, the Chief Operating Officer, Deborah Nichols, had originally started my position out as one to onboard and be able to get around to some of the county health departments, learn about the operation, meet various people, so that I could get off to some good footing as far as finding my way around the Department of Health. That probably took at least the first month or so of my tenure there. So I didn't spend a lot of time initially in the financial statements or the financial data, as the case may be, except the fact that I'd met staff and asked some questions about the operation. After that month, is when I really started to get into asking specific finance questions. As we follow this timeline, then you'll see kind of the steps in that progression. As time went on, very quickly I began to realize that there were several things that were items of concern related to the finances of the agency, and from there is kind of the way that this outline or this timeline will develop. So I will begin to walk through the timeline, and then I will try to fill that with a little bit more specific detail that I believe would be pertinent to understanding what occurred as I go forward. So on April 25th, I hadn't been there that long. I was presented with a board brief for the Board of Health by my budget officer, Sean Tomlinson, and by Felicia Scanlon, who was the director of business planning at the time. She's one of the people that that resigned. I asked at that time finance staff and Ms. Scanlon why their brief was so limited as to financial content. It appeared to be very heavily weighted as to programmatic narrative, and the financial discussion seemed extremely limited to me. I'm very used to seeing financial statements to a board. I'm very used to seeing measurement of current period activity to budgeted activity and analyzing or discussing the variances. So that was not the case. In the book, I believe you'll see, as you get, I heard Mr. Chairman say that there would be copies for everybody, so I can just describe these, and anybody that I guess wants to share that book or take a peek as I go. But I just included that brief, and it's 3 pages long. Talks about some narrative items related to programmatic activities, and then the 3rd page of the brief gives a financial report to the Board of Health, or attempts to, where it's discussing the utilization of budget as red, yellow, and green light status. So at that point, I became extremely concerned early on, and like I said, I still had meetings. I was still traveling around, getting to know people. And I saw that report and said to myself, this seems like it's a little bit light. I don't know exactly what's going on or what we're doing here. But I knew that I had a lot of questions to ask after seeing that. So then you'll see the 3rd entry, April 26th, and I think this is where it becomes very, very relevant about how what happened. You know, everybody's asked, well, what's the problem, or what was the problem, or what occurred? Well, one of the things that I found out right away was there were some very strange terminology being bandied about, and people would talk about payroll not posted. Some of my staff would even utilize the terminology and say P&P. So, you know, I'm thinking to myself, boy, I've been around this for a while in my career, you know, and I've never seen or heard about P&P. But I began to ask a lot of questions about that. And I was very confused, very surprised that there was something happening that was not being posted. About that same time frame, I met with the State Auditor and Inspector's Office for review and discussion of the annual audit engagement, which encompasses the A133 audit of federal programs and so forth. And I was thinking, well, surely, you know, in this audit engagement, and surely from previous audit engagements, you know, if there are problems like this, they'll be uncovered. I probably need to stand down for now and try to learn. I'm sure that there are some issues related to this state agency that I'm not aware of because I'm new, and I will let this audit engagement commence and see what happens here with this payroll not posted. So I met with a woman from the State Auditor and Inspector's Office, Julie Glasscock, regarding the annual audit under what's called a SAS 99 interview. SAS stands for Statement on Auditing Standards. That was, you'll see that entry that says 526. And that is a very common, it's utilized across any number of industries. This is stuff that is put out and governed by various independent enterprises, and the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants comments on all these things. So, you know, not to get down in the details too deeply, but this is a way to commence an audit, to ask some initial questions about risks related to fraud or potential risks related to fraud. The inquiry is commonly driven by questions about knowledge that you may have about fraud, and fraud in this context is not fraud within the legal context. It's fraud which speaks of the risk of a material misstatement to the financial reporting enterprise. So at that time, I answered those questions very honestly as I could. No, I am not aware of fraud in particular, but if I do become aware, I'm new. If I do become aware of that, I will certainly supplement my responses during the pendency of this audit. So I was very clear about that at that meeting. So as we continued on, I began to realize that this board reporting process was controlled by the director of business planning, by and large, Felicia Scanlon. So I started asking questions about, well, there's another board meeting coming up. Surely we're going to provide them something other than this, and what do those things need to be? And of course, I'm very used to having the responsibility for getting those kinds of things together, conducting the analysis on them so that they're correct and so that a proper discussion can occur about those items. And I found that this person was completely in charge of that entire documentation, and I began to ask myself, well, this is awfully strange. I mean, I know I'm the CFO. I've been a CFO before. I'm a little surprised at why we're doing this, and I tried to pursue this person as to try to understand, well, maybe, do they have some extreme qualifications, or is there something that makes them, very qualified to be able to create this report, or is this built upon some relationship where this is what's been requested? And I began to find out that this was a person with no background in finance, and that the communications to the Board of Health were by and large funneled and controlled through this person and her boss, which at the time was the Senior Deputy Commissioner of the agency, Julie Cox-Kane. So I started to really get a lot of concerns about the agency and ask myself a lot of questions about whether or not there were some serious financial issues, and try to start putting together some meetings with staff so I could begin to determine that for myself. On May 31st, I received a cash projection analysis from a gentleman who is a certified public accountant that works under me, that is pretty astute with agency financial reporting and agency activities internally. And that showed various financial issues that related to things like payroll not posted. I saw something that said unrecoupable borrows. So I began to ask then further of him and the other staff, my budget officer, as well as my payments officer. At June 6th, I had a one-on-one meeting with the Senior Deputy Commissioner, Julie Cox-Kane, in which I mentioned the need to address outstanding accounting issues. So we had a meeting. It was the first time. I was surprised. I'd already been here over a month, and I still haven't met with any senior executives. And I'm really used to, as a chief financial officer, your CEO and your governing board, those people want to talk to you right away. They want to express their concerns to you. They want to establish, a strategic plan for, addressing financial issues and reporting and the like. And still hadn't spoken with any of those people. So this was the first meeting. And I started asking some of the questions, that, boy, this payroll not posted thing, I'm a little confused, and I think we have some problems. I think we need to do something about our financial reporting. I think we have a lot of financial reporting issues we should probably address. And at the time, she seemed rather amenable to pursuing that. So I once again was a little bit confused, and I thought, okay, this isn't making sense. It's not what I would normally be used to, but we'll start working on this stuff really diligently, and maybe the interaction will help develop a relationship where they'll understand or ask for more items or maybe, really get involved with me. On June 19th, or June 15th, I'm sorry, I met with Budget Officer Sean Tomlinson and other finance staff about the upcoming fiscal 2018 budget. Again on June 20th. And then again, approximately a week later, on June 28th, met with Sean Tomlinson and other staff, and that also included this business planning director, Felicia Scanlon. That meeting was very surprising to me. There was a lot of information on this, up on an overhead screen. I had seen some of it before, so I was concerned and had been asking the questions, and I was shocked because I could see from looking at this information that the agency was in a terrible position for the upcoming fiscal year. And then I began to start asking a lot of questions of staff. I began to start figuring out on my own what the problems were so that I could understand, A, how we would address them, B, how I would report these to my direct supervisors and the executive leadership, as I normally would anywhere. I received a lengthy email on 6/29 from Ms. Scanlon to me, the Senior Deputy Commissioner Cox Kane, and the Chief Operating Officer, Deborah Nichols at the time, describing the fiscal 2018 budget problems. And that email is important because you'll see its tab in that book. It's tab number 8. And when you get a chance to see that email, you're going to see that it very clearly describes that there are a lot of financial problems. There's a discussion that there were several issues related to the upcoming year that looked very troublesome. I at that point really began to assert myself about how we were going to address these problems, and it was so close to. Of course, we'd already had discussions about, that there were issues, but that we had reached a point where we were close to submitting or needing to submit the budget work program to the Office of Management and Enterprise Services for the upcoming fiscal year, and still being new and really not having any authority at all to do a whole lot with the financial direction of the agency. On June 30th, a budget work program was submitted, and in there you'll see on tab 18, the budget work program submitted makes various attestations about the work, showing that the budget's been developed to fully fund the operations. The agency had not built into the budget the need for supplemental appropriations. And then it named Dr. Terry Klein, the Commissioner of Health. Looks like Julie Cox Kane signed for him. Maybe I suppose she had signature authority to do that. And then it named me underneath that with my name. It said Chief Financial Officer in Oklahoma State Department of Health. And I want to clarify something there, because as you look at that document, in the second paragraph of that document, it says, as authorized by Title 62, Section 3442, I hereby designate Michael J. Romero as our agency, quote, request officer, thereby authorizing him to submit revisions to our fiscal 2018 budget work program and to request allotment of the same. Okay, so if you see that document, you'll see in there, I had some very grave concerns, because if I signed that document, it would appear as though I was responding to the remarks above, which say that legal requirements and the like had been met with this submittal. I did clarify next to my name as Chief Financial Officer, I wrote in pen with a / and I wrote pending designee. Okay? I did that because I did not want any misunderstanding about my position with respect to this submittal. Okay, so one of my big concerns in all of this, and I hope I'm moving along speedily enough, Mr. Chair. One of my concerns in all of this is sometimes these things have seemed to have a tendency publicly to be misconstrued and the like, and we'll get to some of those things. I was still new. I was working very diligently to address problems and address issues internally without authority, and still, at a very early point in my tenure at the agency, making a very big splash at upsetting people by asking difficult questions. I made sure that my name was not associated with this kind of activity. So as we go on, 6:30, you'll see I replied to the 6:29 Scanlon email with a memo warning that the agency was in financial peril and requiring immediate action. And that reply is very important to this committee. That would be tab number 10. And I would hope that all of you get a chance to read that carefully, because what I did, and I'm just going to read a short quote from it, but I said, Felicia, I have given consideration to thoughtfully reply to the below email, and after our further discussion, I want to be clear in directing such toward the agency, as it is an agency issue first and foremost. Therefore, at this juncture, I am submitting the attached response as a limited audience memo, and I sent that to Felicia Scanlon as a reply, to Julie Cox-Kane, who was the Senior Deputy Commissioner, and to the direct report of mine, the Chief Operating Officer. I reported to her, Deborah Nichols. And that memo is in that tab and talks about some of the problems, but I'll just give you the last two sentences, which was my recommendation. It's my professional opinion that it is immediately incumbent, and mind you, this is June 30th of 2017, that it is immediately incumbent upon this agency to take those steps which absolutely close the current budget gap within the shortest time frame, and also address amortization of the previously created, quote, borrows deficit. The OSDH SFY18 budget cannot withstand the projected activity level. Okay, so it had been fairly early on, and I was making sure to let these folks know. On July 5th, I received a lengthy reply from Julie Cox-Kane regarding the memo. That's in there. One of the things I found out right away was, and I believe Deborah Nichols, the Chief Operating Officer, told me this, and I realized that it had created a stir. I didn't know that it would, but it became my understanding that the agency didn't like memos. So, you know, being an experienced accountant, being a chief financial officer, representing folks, consulting with folks, you know, I've spent my career, many years, providing memos. I mean, it's one of the things that you do to provide information, to document understanding of how that information works. And so I was surprised once again. And at that point, I realized that there were going to be some real problems. I received a lengthy reply from Julie Cox-Kane on July 5th about that memo, and that's also in the book. At this point in time, many of these items that we're talking about, and they're all in this book, they're down in the weeds with detail, and I'm really trying. I really know exactly what's occurred here, and I know exactly what the problems are, and I will explain them very clearly so we all understand them. So I'm trying to get to those points. So I don't want to belabor this with things that we don't need yet. So I'm kind of trying to move to the important stuff. I met on 21, or I'm sorry, on 7/18, I provided a clear financial overview of agency financial issues on screen at an agency senior leadership meeting. So I put these up on a big screen. It was the first time I'd ever been invited to the senior leadership meeting since I'd been there. So I'm thinking, man, what do you do with the chief financial officer? He doesn't come to the senior. I've never heard of an enterprise like this, but the chief financial officer's not part of the senior leadership meetings. So now, this had become, I had really stirred the pot quite a bit. I was invited to the senior leadership meeting. I provided a very clear, this is in tab number 12, and this is just a component of what I could print off because it's probably easier to get it through an electronic version, Mr. Chair, because it's in Excel. So some of them are longer than the page will allow to print off. So I printed the pertinent items, and then we can provide that in Excel format. But one of the things that I did on screen was just start letting the senior leadership group know with the deputy commissioner present there, we have some problems related to generally accepted accounting principles and how you operate within those principles and what the risk levels are for this agency. I identified several areas of financial concern. I identified payroll that wasn't being posted, and I'm going to talk about that briefly. I identified in there, and this is in the binder, I wrote 10 basic concepts to clarify the agency financial situation, and those are Roman numeral 1 through 10. And then between that, and this is presented on screen, mind you, and then at the end I wrote action steps for the Department of Health's financial situation. There'd never been financial reporting in this agency, so I was asking staff, hey, let me see your last financial report. Where are the financial statements? So they didn't have any. I knew that I needed to ask specific questions because I'd heard about the payroll not posted. So then it was pretty easy because I'm really used to asking these questions. I'm used to dealing with very good auditors, very competent auditors. I'm used to dealing with auditors related to legal proceedings and all kinds of things like that. So I'm used to the questions, but they're really common. You ask, hey, do you have any open accounting periods? You have any accounting periods that you haven't closed? Well, then I find out from staff, yeah, we have open accounting periods. And then I say, so is payroll not posted? Do you have any costs or other costs that are not posted from those prior periods? Yes, we have those. Okay, so then the next question, which is a real easy one, okay, the next question is, do you have a credit facility you're using to run your operations, a line of credit somewhere? Well, not exactly. So I said, well, yes, then you do, right? Well, I guess we do. Okay, so from there it becomes my first inclination that I find out we got a really big problem here. Okay, and those are easy questions to ask because I know if you're not posting a cost but you've expended it, right? You've paid for something. So if you can't put it in your books, right? You've got an accounting problem. Your books have some built-in internal control that's preventing you from cheating the system, right? But you fronted costs. So you've expended cash. So these are easy questions. So that is going to dovetail as we roll forward to some of the issues, and you'll see in there this is very rudimentary because normally when you report on from a financial statement perspective within a nonprofit perspective or fund account, what we call fund accounting. Okay, funds exist separately. A fund, if you were going to talk about, well, our federal funds, a fund at the rolled up level or even at a detail level of a fund is a self-balancing set of accounts. Okay, and that fund would be kind of like a whole business, right? A business is going to have, right, assets, liabilities, and owner's equity, right? So that's what a fund does. A fund is a self-balancing set of accounts. Typically, funds don't this is a fact. I mean, funds don't combine, they don't intermingle. They stand on their own, and they exist in that capacity for transparency, for the protection of the interest of honesty and reporting and all the matters that relate thereto. But what I did was I just kind of took the information that I'd found, and I said, I'm going to aggregate that. I'm just going to look at some of these problems I've found and try to create the first balance sheet I've seen since I've been here for the enterprise, because I know the enterprise has to be suffering from negative net position if it's expending money it doesn't have. And I was able to push out a number, and you'll see it on there, $29,429,754.99. Okay. And I did that, given the information that I had, taking all of the information and kind of making it one. It's not really a formal reporting convention for reporting on financial results like you'd see, in any common reporting enterprise that's operating properly. This was for the sake of showing that group. Because I was showing that group we've got a real financial problem here, and I was able to pinpoint it within that range. So people have asked about the $30 million. So I wanted to kind of give you that. And one of the things that I posed to the group, I said, I think the agency has a lot of negative equity. And I think that's a big concern for us as an agency. A common accounting equation for funds, or a balance sheet equation: assets equal liabilities plus equity. Okay, and you can take that and you can play with it algebraically. It always works. Equity also equals assets minus liabilities. So I began to express to them that there's a lot of negative equity, because we've got all these items that we can identify, and we've expended the funds, right? So we have a bunch of negative equity. We have a bunch of money that we've utilized to operate operations here that's not been recovered but been expended, and we're going to need to cover that somehow. I know that was really shocking for folks to hear for the first time internally, but it needed to be said, and it is kind of going to help us understand exactly A, what occurred, and B, how it occurred. So anyway, going on, and we'll be through with this timeline pretty quickly because it starts to move fast. So I then, was having discussions with staff about the credit facility and said, hey, if you're running a line of credit, I need to know how that's working, because to me it sure looks like you got to have a line of credit. It's the only way that you could do this. And if you have a line of credit, or if you're using cash somewhere, that's a bad thing, because if we're doing that, we're going to put ourselves in peril with other bills and with other things that we have to pay for. Well, especially in situations like this with some of the serious issues that have occurred, you hate to be right. On July 21st, I received a reply from my payments officer regarding depletion of restricted Ryan White Fund dollars. So I, asked a lot of questions. I was really concerned because from that, bills for supplemental insurance payments for HIV/AIDS victims is part of what's being paid for with those funds. I met with Senior Deputy Commissioner Cox Kane, the Commissioner Terry Klein, the Chief Operating Officer Deborah Nichols, and I talked to them about payroll payment issues and Ryan White Fund dollar depletion. I even provided a little statement in there just for that meeting, which I didn't send by email, but I provided it in tab number 13, and you'll see it in there when you look at this. But it's just several bullet points, and I said, hey, this money has been depleted because payroll was fronted with these funds, and we've got a serious problem. At that point, it was a very stressful meeting. I was asked a couple of times, even at that point, well, what do we do? You know, what do you want us to do? I think it was one of the things that the senior deputy commissioner said to me. But one of the things that I said in the meeting, and I remember this as clear as a bell, but one of the things that I said was, well, I'd like you to tell somebody. You need to tell. We need to tell. Somebody needs to be told. Okay? I was met with the response that we're going to be forming incident command. And incident command, of course, when I started the agency, one of the trainings you take early on to get familiarity with the agency and so forth is what incident command is. And incident command is, it's a FEMA program for addressing a disaster type of emergency and obtaining, interoperability and logistical considerations and bringing that all into one group and being able to perform properly. And so I'm thinking to myself, what's incident command going to do for this? I mean, I was lost. I'm thinking that this is opposite world. This is the strangest thing I've ever heard of. But I had then begun to recognize the tone at the top of this agency, which was, listen, we're going to do things our way. If you don't like it, too bad. A lot of people in that agency very afraid for their jobs. These are longtime employees. Some of these people, people that work for me, 20-plus year employees, super bright, super hardworking people that care a lot about what they do, that serve the state with effort and dedication that should make all of us proud, okay? It should make us proud. And these people are being treated like doormats in there, okay? And afraid for their jobs, So, one of the reasons I'm here, one of the reasons you're going to hear a lot of passion in my voice is because of those people that work for me. I'm proud of them, and I'm proud of the job that they've done. But to see what was going on and to see that these people could be pushed aside and basically be tasked with the onerous burden of saying, we're going to run like this and it's too darn bad, you're going to make it work. It's basically how these people had to work in fear of their jobs. I'm a new person. I've been there since April. I'm not a long-time state employee. Okay, I'm used to being around environments where there's financial reporting. I'm a duly licensed professional, so the professions, they govern us with a certain level of objectivity and independence like they should. Okay, so I couldn't care less about those people or what they were saying because of my responsibility to the state of Oklahoma, because of the fiduciary responsibility that any CFO position holds, especially so in a public setting like this, where the citizens are relying upon your performance. I couldn't care less. I was going to do exactly what I needed to do to solve the problem and get this straightened out. So the incident command structure was formed. Julie Cox Kane was the incident commander, the senior deputy commissioner. So, upon looking at that, I'm saying to myself, what is this? This is ridiculous, right? First of all, we've got a person that, the whole incident command is being stood up over finance. We've got a person that's not a finance person that's going to run incident command, right? And we're going to be in this group where everybody's going to be nervous about what they're supposed to say. I mean, the whole thing from beginning to end reminded me of various oppressive totalitarian regimes in other parts of the world that have nothing to do with this country or the way that we operate with respect to our responsibility to the public and these funds, right? So I was outraged and livid about this. At that point, on July 26th, I had spoken with my direct supervisor, Deborah Nichols, who's the chief operating officer of the entity, and let her know I am going to supplement my original, remember I spoke about Statement on Auditing Standards 99, the original interview that I had in May. I'm going to supplement my interview response to SAS 99. And I notified her so that we could meet with the senior executive leaders of the agency, because my decision in doing that was completely, there was nothing underhanded, nothing sneaky about this. I mean, at this point, I'm on everybody's nerves. Hopefully I'm not on your nerves, right? But I'm doing the best I can. I'm on everybody's nerves there, and I know that the best way to do this is to be completely open. We're going to tell the truth. And I let them know that. So there was nothing clandestine about, getting to the state auditor. In my profession as an accountant, and I told you I'm familiar with these things, I knew there was a responsible way to do this. It was not by being a whistleblower, but it was by getting to the people that would be the right people to solve this problem. Okay? Like I told you, I'm an attorney. I'm aware of my rights as a whistleblower under Title 74. Nobody's got to tell me that. I was concerned about the public's perception of this agency, of the service requirement and delivery requirements throughout the state for important services and the public's trust in those services. I was a new person. I knew that the right venue, the right professional avenue for this information was during the pendency and scope of the annual audit, to go with the SAS, Statement on Auditing Standards 99, supplement to my original answers, which I did not have enough relevant information because I was too new to provide. Okay? I'm going to take a 1-second segue there and tell you I have been highly disappointed at some of the characterization of that of that act. This was characterized in front of this committee, that there were people that wanted to restate their fraud statement. I believe that was one of the characterizations by the state auditor inspector. I was never afraid to report the truth. I did this for the very reason that it should have been reported immediately and should have occurred through these proper channels of the audit that was currently occurring. Okay, so I provided in there a supplement, and you will see that on tab number 15. And that supplement, it's been bandied about a little bit through some discussions and arguments about when things should have occurred and so on and so forth. I'm not here to discuss that, but I do want to talk about that supplement very briefly, as I'm sure you'll ask me questions about it. That supplement had in it 27 points. 27. I mean, I was trying to get to the good stuff as fast as I can, because I know something needs to be done and I need to get to people that can do it. In that supplement, the supplement was not dated on purpose, because it was part of a verbal exchange within the audit. I was attempting to protect the integrity of the process, and work as professionally as I could within that process by providing the supplement. But I will tell you the first sentence of the supplement, okay? Because one of the reasons why I'm outraged at some of the things that have gone on is right there. Quote, OSDH agency is insolvent and can barely make its bi-weekly agency payroll. And then the next sentence, also really important. OSD agency shows negative trends, other indications of possible financial difficulties, inability to continue to meet its obligations as they become due without additional cash infusion outside the ordinary course of business, externally forced revisions of its operations or similar actions, meaning obviously other people have to get involved. Accountants know insolvency. as most of us do, means not being able to pay your debts as they become due, providing this to the state auditor and inspector's office, then there are specific details in there about the problems and the dollars. Okay, so no one was ever blowing the whistle. I'm not a whistleblower. I'm a really good professional, and this was a step that was taken to be able to expedite this process through a channel that should have expedited the process and brought the appropriate remediation right away. So as we go on, and that's in there for you to read. As we go on, I met with the SAI's office, the State Auditor Inspector's office, about the supplement. I spoke with the man that was in charge, or the auditor in charge of our annual audit, and explained a lot of things. I could see it was kind of complex for him, probably shocking, and he's a real smart man, so, not that he's not, but it's a lot of information at once. So, I thought by providing this that they could then take the immediate steps that they needed to take. Obviously, the agency leadership was not going to notify anybody that they should have notified. I'd even go so far, I recall very clearly saying back to agency leadership when we were having these discussions, has anybody let Mr. Dorflinger know, or would anybody let Mr. Dorflinger know, or should we let Mr. Dorflinger know? That was way back before I even made my SAS supplement. But anyway, on August 1st, I met with that office and provided that supplement. So, here's where kind of some of the details begin to fill in, and then I'll be able to explain the problems really pretty quickly. So August 1st and beyond, and that's there, and you'll see that about 3/4 of the way down the first page of that timeline. We're having these incident command meetings all the time. These weird meetings about I don't know what, and I don't know how we're going to solve the problem. But the continued discussion over and over again in the meetings is, we're going to find cash, okay? And I've already said, you folks have seen, and if you look in this document, and I provided documentation saying, you're in the hole about $30 million. The cash doesn't exist, And then I said, we've got unposted costs, so we're probably, using cash incorrectly. And the again, repeated comments over and over from the incident commander, we've got to find cash, or we're going to find cash, or we're going to, and the director of business planning, who was the logistics chief also inside the incident command, would say, yes, well, we'll just take these steps to quote, find cash. And I kept saying, well, cash doesn't exist. We need to get the cash externally. We're not a business. We can't sell more product or raise our margins. We don't have cash. It's gone. So that was the commencement of this whole discussion you've heard about the Tobacco Settlement Endowment Trust, and there's all these things in the media about T-Set and what happened. Yeah, that's a lot of detail that we don't need just yet. Essentially, what had happened was there was a bunch of money that had been fronted to T-Set by the Department of Health in years prior, I think 2011, that somehow all of a sudden portions of it could be recovered, which magically I didn't know how. One of the things that I have in there, it is an email about, and I believe, let's see, that's tab 16. There's August emails regarding the T-Set transfer, but one of them says, hey, I can get this from the Senior Deputy Commissioner Cox Kane. I can get this money back from T-Set, and the email says this quote, it's in the millions. So I'm on this email string and I'm going, what? How are you going to get money back in the million? I don't even understand what you're talking about. And then I ask in the incident command meetings, well, how does this work? I mean, is their board involved? how did they get this money? How do they send it back? I'm just trying to understand. I'm just an accounting person trying to understand how in the world do these relationships exist? And how do these people just by fiat come out and say, I'll get money back. I'll make a phone call. I was shocked, right? So just like anybody would be. So I started questioning in person and email. You'll see 8, 11, and beyond to the general counsel of the agency at the time about the legitimacy of these arrangements and various questions about that. Got a lot of silly answers back. And then on 8/12, I attended the annual Board of Health retreat at OSU Stillwater. At that retreat, I didn't attend both days. I attended the second day, which was a Saturday. I publicly explained that there were severe agency cash and accounting problems when asked by the senior deputy commissioner. She was giving a presentation, and she asked some questions. And I took the time to freely explain to everybody there that, hey, we've got payroll not posted. We have serious financial problems. We are in serious financial peril. And, I'm explaining these things, and I could see that there were some people, somewhat concerned, but yet nothing really was happening. The board chair asked a couple of questions and said, I'm having trouble understanding what a journal entry for this would look like. And I said, well, there is no journal entry. The agency's in financial peril because it's overextended. It's expended more cash than it has. I was explaining that pretty clearly at that meeting. So a couple of weeks went by, and I'm thinking to myself, my goodness, when is something going to happen? We're still sitting there. And one of the things this is something I did because I was concerned about identification of restricted funds. I was concerned about, how we fulfill our fiduciary duty internally if other people aren't going to do the right thing. I tasked staff and worked with them to prepare a daily cash report for the agency. And that report identified available cash. There's a sample of it in this book. And if you follow the table of contents, you can just read these items. They'll be right there listed on the table of contents, so you'll find them. But that identified available cash and restricted funds held at OMES. So obviously the funds aren't held by the Department of Health. The accounting's occurring at the Department of Health. The funds are over at OMES. So I said, hey, we're gonna identify these funds. We're going to identify restricted funds. We are going to show our payroll obligation and push our payroll obligation against accounts payable, restricted funds, and available cash. Thus, we will show a net risk, right, every 2 weeks when we have to load that payroll up. So one of the things that I began to do, so when you heard people talking about payroll default, okay, and there were a lot of questions and public questions, I'll clarify that right now. That started happening when I started propounding this report on a daily basis, okay? So I would make it very clear. It was daily. The report was delivered daily to senior leadership that I had been to the first few meetings to, and I said, I'm going to provide this. I'm going to make sure everybody understands what's the risk of loading payroll, because never again on my watch is this agency going to fund any payroll with restricted federal dollars. It's not going to happen. So, I don't know at this point what the state auditor inspector is doing. I don't know if the board members or anybody's going to do anything. But I'm making sure that's never going to happen again with payroll, and that's what this report did. We still use it every day. We use it. I make sure it's utilized every day. Staff completes it. It's a fairly complex report, and then I analyze it every day. So that was a corrective measure that we took internally that I was responsible for to protect the citizens of the state and the important federal dollars that flow to the agency. Again, in middle of September, I again kept getting these questions from the senior deputy commissioner out of this incident command. We're going to hold cash meetings, and over. We're going to hold cash meetings. When I was about, it's a wonder I'm even here, because I couldn't take it anymore listening about the cash meetings. You know, as I'd said 100 times, there isn't any cash. What meeting are you going to have? You know, so I'm trying to understand what's happening here, and it's almost beginning to me. You know, these are some smart people, and I'm saying this is extremely unrealistic. You know, this is starting to sound to me like, you know, when my 14-year-old son wants an expensive pair of basketball shoes, I ask him if he has any money, and he tells me, no, I tell him that's not how it works. You know, and this is sounding like that. I mean, it's not making any sense. And so I meet with her Cox Kane about the budget and the agency cash. And then there's a report due to a legislative request regarding agency funding, okay? And on that report, I worked with my staff because I said, you know what? Maybe I'll get the message through this way. Nothing's happened. There's I don't see the state auditor doing anything. I don't see anything happening. So nobody's taking steps that ought to be taken immediately. I'm providing a report every day that shows we have a risk of payroll default. I mean, you'd think everybody should be falling apart here, you know. So my staff helped me prepare, you know, these reports that come to the legislative staff that show agency finances and, you know, what the budget looks like for the year and so forth. And I had them specifically push out our annual appropriation around $53 million. Well, they showed that with me that the annual appropriation appeared to be $63 million. And I said to myself, boy, if they see this, you know, this should be great, right? So I think one of those got through. Our legislative policy person, Brian Downs, had, I think, forwarded one along because I gave one to him that looked like that and showed the $63 million as being our appropriation. I thought surely someone will call. He forwarded that along, and nothing had particularly happened. But one of the things that really upset me about this is Felicia Scanlon and Julie Cox Kane wanted to vet everything. So they said, hey, are you done with that? And I didn't realize they were going to take it and change it. So they took it and started changing it and taking that $10 million that I showed additional that we had basically burdened ourselves up with and not been appropriated. And they changed that and created in the report a little segment for that $10 million that looked like it was part of funded operations. I think they called it operating fund, okay? And Felicia Scanlon sent me an email and asked, is that okay? Are Julie's edits okay? I believe that's tab number 20. And I responded, it's not okay. I put two links to statute in there about balanced budgets and about unconstitutional debt. So then there was a lengthy on 9/21. Cox Kane had requested for me a cash management plan, and I sent a lengthy email to her and Scanlon describing what I'm telling you, that there's no cash management plan. The agency's basically bankrupt. That's tab 21 in there. Really clear. And, you know, I'm watching this unfold, and you know, I've been around. I know this is going to end up being public at some juncture. So these emails are constructed very clearly to describe the problem, not just for the folks that were reading it, but also so that when somebody else saw it someday, they would see, hey, this problem had been very clearly described to people over and over again. Okay? So then we're at the second page, and we're almost done. There was on 9/27, so there had been a lot of discussion about furloughs and so forth, of what are we going to do to address the budget problems. Again, nobody's real. I have responsibility with no authority. Okay, a very wise person told me once to never do anything where that's the case. But that's what was going on here, because I wasn't involved in well, how are we going to make communications to the legislature about finance? How are we going to make communications to the public about addressing the furlough and any potential reductions in finance and so forth? And you'll see, and this is in tab 22. And I wrote in there false and misleading remarks from executive leaders regarding fiscal shortfall. And again, it's real frustrating to me because there were misleading remarks about how cuts and so forth and federal reductions had affected the state agency. Nobody's telling the truth that, look, you've overexpended your dollars and you're utilizing the cash that's maintained at OMES as a credit facility. That's what you did. Okay, so this big, long, strange story about how there have been reductions and we're meeting these, and it, one of the things that had come out previously had been public budget watch communications from the agency that said, we have these terrible fiscal times and we're meeting this crisis as we have before in times past, and that's why we're using incident command. It's complete baloney. It was never true, So I had a meeting at so this 927 was a director's meeting, and the then commissioner, Dr. Klein, gave a statement, and Julie Cox-Kane gave a statement, and all these directors are in there, and they're all sitting there trying to understand what are we doing? What's going on? Because they're talking about furloughs and how we're going to have to look at these cuts and reductions and all these crazy things about, well, our funds have been reduced and we can, And then Julie Cox-Kane asked me if I'd like to say something and to explain because someone had a question, and this was very much off the cuff. At that point, I was so frustrated. Normally I never have a problem speaking to a group, and I was so angry I could hardly say a word because I couldn't believe what was going on. Afterwards, Ms. Scanlon came to my office and asked me if everything was okay, and personally, and I let her know about my disappointment with the remarks, and I told her, look, there are serious violations of law occurring here. They are getting very, very serious. We are not telling the truth to the public. There are communications from public officials that are not honest, and I'm not part of that, and I'm not going to support that. And I am going to take any other drastic measure that I can, because if nobody's going to do anything about what's going on here, I will. But I'm not going to tolerate this. Later that so she's visibly shaken, crying in my office from me saying that, because I said this stuff is criminal. And then at that point she left my office. I had a communication with somebody that office next to her, and later, and he said, what was wrong with Felicia? She was crying and went running into Julie Cox-Kane's office in tears. And I said, well, she just left my office, and I told her I was done with this stuff. That I wasn't gonna tolerate this, and these are criminal. This is getting to be criminal stuff that's going on here. The next morning, okay? The next morning is that audit request to the state auditor and inspector through the commissioner, Terry Klein. Okay? That audit request, those are all things that I already been sitting around talking about in the meetings. Payroll not posted, this unposted costs and unrecoupable borrows and things like that. It's all stuff that I've already been talking about in the meeting. These people are falling apart, nervous, and so I don't know why, if they again didn't come talk to me, because I would have explained to them, that I'd already given that information, and they might just wait a little bit, or I could have helped them craft the request, but no, they weren't. I was not even involved in that. Okay, so then very shortly thereafter, I believe that day, Dr. Klein requested a meeting with me and him and the agency general counsel. It was my understanding that some of the people were going around saying, I better not be saying things are criminal. So So I told him, hey, I found out the general counsel was in there waiting for me with him, and I said, you'll have to give me a little bit of time because I'm going to have my counsel present with me if you'd like to meet. To which he told me, no, we can meet one-on-one. So the discussion with me was about, basically why are you saying things are criminal, like that, and if you are, please, notify the Office of Accountability Systems if there's anything criminal going on. I said, what do you think this mess is? And we have people that are complete non-professionals running this. We're going to have to make some fast changes here, So anyway, you can imagine my frustration because I'm sure you're hearing it in my voice. In 10.1 and beyond, pretty easy. Multiple small group discussions again about cash. 10.3, there's a tri-board Board of Health meeting in Tulsa with the Department of Health and then Tulsa County Health Department, Oklahoma City County Health Department. I speak with the executive committee in there and again explain, got some real financial problems. This is serious. Okay, this is 10.3, and I'm being real clear about this. And I'm thinking to myself, boy, what's going on? Because I've never seen this anywhere in my life. In private industry, if these kinds of things were going on, if these kind of things were going on, people would be fired or thrown out in a day. So I've never seen anything like this. 10.4, I have an email exchange with Cox Kane because she's asked me this question, and this is also in your booklet I've given you. But I have an email exchange with her where she asked me, this is tab 23. She asked me some things. Hey, can we identify specific, restricted funds? Can you set up a report to do that? And by the way, I can't see your cash report. And so I respond pretty harshly there because I say, well, you mean all this time you're telling me you haven't been looking at the cash report? That's what the cash report does. So they're not even looking at it. So anyway, that's when I know you met with Ms. Nichols, the former chief operating officer, and she talked about this report. Met with 3 board members on the 18th with that report. I think was provided in here, and it's also in this book. It's tab 24. Okay, and you've seen that report. A week prior to that, I had met again with Mike Starchman and Melissa Capps. They're with the State Department, or with the State Auditor Inspector's Office. And again, went over various items from my initial SAS 99 supplement. Okay. On October 23rd, I met with Roy Garcia and Matt Clarkson of OMES regarding the state CAFR reporting package. They were surprised and wanted to meet because one of the things in that package is some questions about debt and so forth for the agency, and this is an annual package where they, request information. And, I saw that package and discussed that with my staff, and I said, well, I want you to turn this in, and I checked off items for debt and sent that to them. And we had a little discussion on it. I know it's kind of hard because when you talk about debt, sometimes people are thinking about, did you buy an asset or what do you have? And it's very hard to understand why. I'm going to explain to you in a minute how that works. But, if you've overextended yourself and you've been paying for it somehow, right, and you're going to need money from some other place, you've got to have some kind of debt. Okay, obviously you wouldn't need external money if you didn't. And if you crash, you're going to have permanent debt, right? We've got, besides the payroll, and people have talked about this, we still had all the accounts payable, right? Just as much debt as anything else if you can't pay it. So on 10/27, I had continuing meetings about the cash and budget with Cox, Kane, Nichols. Other folks were in there. the meetings were pressure packed throughout that day. But all of a sudden, it seemed like at that day was when Cox, Kane, and Klein seemed aware and apprised of the fact that it was time to tell the truth. So can you imagine how exhausted I am at this point and all these months? So finally, we're going to tell the truth. And then at 10:30, I believe, which was a Monday, there was an entrance conference with the state auditor and inspector about this extra request they had made for that audit. And Dr. Klein was not present, and Julie Cox Kane was not present, and that was when I found out that they had resigned, like kind of right after that meeting, that that the whole thing was going on, that the resignations were occurring. And you'll see in this book here, so that's done with the timeline. You'll see in this book in the table of contents, there's also a book 2. So book 2, I just separated them because book 2 was just kind of some supplemental stuff after I'd put the first round together. But book 2 was the tab 1, 726, a false public communication from the agency. That's where they sent out that budget watch thing that I told you, where they said, hey, we're going to meet this crisis like we always have in the past. We're going to stand up incident command and we're going to solve this problem, right? Tab 2 was the 727, 17 communications about the Ryan White Fund, and communication from Cox Kane about TSET money that has the quote, "It's in the millions." Okay. Tab 3 is a November 20th, 17 email from the Department of Health Chief Operating Officer Nichols to the OMES Chief Technical Officer about IT projects. Tab 4 was an August 2017 email, several of them from me to the State Auditor Inspector's Office about the large TSET transfer and my questions of it. Tab 5 is an 11/14/17 letter from HRSA, the Health Resources Services Administration, regarding the use of federal funds. And then tab 7 is an 11/9/17 letter to TSET from Interim Commissioner Dorflinger about the TSET transactions. So that is the book, and the timeline, which gives, I guess, the background. I'm sure that now you'll have a lot of questions, and I will try to answer those questions that will hopefully try to help understand how this happened, what some of the problems are, and so forth. And if there's any questions about anything I described off of that timeline list, I'll be happy to answer those as well.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Romero, for such a detailed overview of the timeline and documentation. This time we'll go into member questioning period. So we'll do this as we've done it every time before. We'll start with Representative Gann. Representative Gann, you're recognized for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Mr. Romero. You mentioned in your testimony that you never saw a set of financial statements. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Then what, in your mind, was the State Auditor and Inspector General auditing when he came to audit on an annual basis?
Well, I knew that it was the A133 audit related to the expenditure of federal funds. So there are various forms related to those expenditures and the like. So a lot of federal funds related items. He wasn't particularly, in my understanding, auditing internally prepared financial statements of operations per se.
Do you think he was meeting the requirements of the law set out for him to audit the agencies every year?
Oh, I don't want to speculate as to what the law requires. I mean, I have a lot of concerns about maybe the way that the audit was planned, but I don't know. I don't want to speak to whether or not what the legal requirements were.
So the auditors actually came on site to interview you?
In the beginning, yeah, in May, that was when I had the SAS 99 audit questions about fraud risk.
So in the time that you initially met with the auditor on May 3rd to the follow-up meeting with the 99 supplement that you wanted to add to,
Yes.
was did the auditor become concerned about what was going on? Did they ask you any additional questions? Did it raise any red flags with them with your concerns?
Well, I had an additional, like I said, I had an additional meeting on October 10th with Mike Starchman and Melissa Capps, and went over various items from the initial supplement. From the time that I met with one of the auditors on August 1st to that time, I sent, and those are marked in the tabs in that binder, but I sent some emails saying, look at this TSET stuff. I mean, look at what's going on here. There are no internal controls. This thing is a mess. I sent a couple of emails like that, but I had no interaction with the auditor after that, and I was also shocked that I was never contacted at all from the time that I made the initial contact with the state auditor's office on August 1st. I was never contacted by Mr. Jones, and there was no meeting, no follow-up meeting, no call. I thought, my goodness, I'll be having to answer questions, all kinds of questions, and I'm sure he'll want to meet with me, but nothing of the sort.
On the Ryan White federal money, that account, were you ever instructed, or who instructed the people to use that money to cover payroll?
That's a great question. And I'd like to take the opportunity in answering that question to explain maybe one of the main reason why that happened. Because nobody particularly instructed somebody and said, use Ryan White funds to cover payroll. Okay, so you've asked the question that is the question that I believe the chairman has asked, or I've seen stated in public. We want to find out what happened and so forth. And I think that dovetails very well to some prior testimony that was given here by Interim Commissioner Dorflinger and Director of OMS Denise Northrup about the system in general. And that is, nobody instructed or said, use Ryan White Fund dollars. Okay, so earlier when I said that there was a line of credit, I asked, I said, if we're paying things that we can't post, then we're getting cash from somewhere, right? And our system's telling us we can't post it because our system is rejecting the concept of that expenditure. Our system at the Department of Health is about a 35, 6, 7-year-old mainframe system, but the system records costs. It records those costs only if there's sufficient cash to record the cost. So within that system, there are 3 major funds, and there are 3 major funds at the Office of Management and Enterprise Services that match the 3 major funds that are reported on the system at the Department of Health. And those funds are the funds that hold the state appropriated dollars, the funds that hold the revolving fund dollars, and the funds that hold the federal dollars. Okay? So within each fund at the Department of Health, then there are multiple programmatic divisions within those funds. Okay? At the OMES level, those programmatic divisions don't exist. So in other words, when the payroll is paid and the cash is expended, it's expended at a summary level from OMES. So I believe that both Interim Commissioner and Denise Northrup had explained that that system over there doesn't see the level of detail that the agency mainframe system sees.
That was going to be my next question, is why OMES did not see it like that. So you're saying that is a control deficiency right there where they're not getting the type of detail that they need to get to oversee that particular agency. Would you
Well,
agree?
and they both let you know that system doesn't see at the detail level. So when the funds are expended for payroll, right? Those funds, the way it normally works is that payroll just goes out of that federal fund like a chute, okay? And then if there's any other related cost to payroll, obviously, that may apply to the revolving fund or the state fund, those costs are then realigned to the appropriate fund after the fund is utilized as a mechanism to forward the payment for the payroll. So when you talk about payroll not being posted at the OSDH system, what's essentially happening is there's cash, like cash in a big pile, like a big bucket, and it's been expended, okay? And when it was expended at OMES, it wasn't expended as to a particular program area, okay? So then that would obviously answer that, nobody said, hey, spend the Ryan White funds for payroll. The payroll was paid, and that fund was already low on cash, thus becoming so low that there was not enough cash to utilize to pay for the Ryan White costs.
On January 1st of this year, we received the corrective action plan from the health department on to alleviate and mitigate these internal control deficiencies. Have you been involved in that process?
Yes, I was. Several of those items in there. I mean, not particularly some of the consolidation efforts and so forth, but the items that really pertain to what's going to happen with the proper way to utilize the system to budget, the proper way to close the books, the proper way to conduct financial reporting, that financial reporting should be under a certain internal controls framework and so forth. Those are my ideas, and yes, I was involved in that.
Thank you, Mr. Romero. If I have any remaining time, I'd like to give that to Representative Calvi.
Representative Calvi will have an additional 1 minute. Representative Martinez, you're recognized for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't imagine I'll take the full 10 minutes here, but if I do, I'm not trying to lie, but I don't picture that. Mr. Romero, thank you for being here, your willingness to bring documentation and share some of these details with us. You did such a thorough job going through the timeline that I don't have a lot of questions, but I will say, if you go back up to April 25th, looks like you were there for about a week, and at that point you say that you brought up some concerns about the content of the board brief and how it was very heavy on program narrative but not much of the financial side. Did this appear to be the norm, and was this the only way that the board was getting communications on a regular basis?
It certainly appeared to be the norm very quickly when I saw the next one. And it seemed to be the only way they were getting communications, and it also appeared as though those communications were very controlled and very thoroughly and cautiously vetted as to what that content would be. So I was kind of notified early on, hey, don't be thinking you're going to change what's given to the board because we control that.
When you started asking questions about the contents of these reports, I mean, what were some of the responses you're getting? Do you remember specifically, by any chance, what, it looks like you said you specifically asked some of the finance staff that have been there for a while. I mean, did they know not to ask questions about it? Or
Absolutely. I'll tell you, I have finance staff, my lead budget officer, Sean Tomlinson, very smart man, told me, listen, I don't want to be involved in this. One of the last ones I was involved in, I found out that they were changing items on the report or making my budget staff change budgets so that the report would appear to reflect some different things. And one of the things he told me was the deputy commissioner for community family health went to the meeting when he was ready to present and said, if I have this much money, why are my positions being denied? So he said, I'm he told me these reports are really not too good, and so so I began to get that from staff, and of course, like I said, from those in charge. Hey, these are going to be the reports. This is what we're giving.
You mentioned that there are instances where employees were being treated like doormats, or it was like working under authoritarian rule at times. Can you give specific examples? I know obviously this situation paints a pretty clear picture of that. Can you give any other examples you can think of off the top of your head?
Sure.
Or you would-
I mean, pretty straightforwardly. I mean, these people have been saying there's a problem for quite some time, and we're essentially told that by fiat, this is what we're going to do. You're going to make it work, and these people have let me know that they had been clear for a long time about saying we can't operate like this. We're not matching expenditures to known revenues, and with the understanding that you'll make it work. My budget officer, who's in charge of budget and funding, would tell me, hey, I don't even have a say because these people that are in charge, this business planning director calls up my budget and funding people and tells them to change budgets, and just calls them up and says, move this budget here, move this budget there. And these budget and funding people are scared to death, wondering if they don't do this when they're going to lose their job. So it was an atmosphere in general of fear and intimidation. And I know people became shocked and let me know that very early on. My goodness, I can't believe you're willing to say these things. You don't plan on being here very long, do you? And I would let them know, well, it doesn't really matter. We're going to address the problem. That's what I'm here to do. So yeah, several instances like that where, these folks were just generally very afraid to confront the senior deputy commissioner, and very afraid to confront the business planning director, her assistant, which, that business planning director, person with no financial background, no financial training, no financial education of any kind, would come to me with these various, financial mandates they were instituting through finance and so on and so forth, and she would use this terminology with me. She would tell me, and she would tell my financial staff, my boss says, and then would say, we're going to do this or that. And these people knew, and that was the code language to make sure you jump and get this done. And one of the things that happened later on when I sent her packing from my office was me saying, you can get your boss, you can get you can get the commissioner here in my office, and I'm going to tell them exactly the same thing I'm telling you. This stuff's stopping right now.
I just want to say thank you again. I appreciate your time and your willingness to be here. Mr. Chairman, I would like to yield the rest of my time to the chair. Thanks.
4 minutes has been yielded to the chair. Representative Caldwell, you are recognized for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Romero, thank you for being here today. I guess more importantly, I want to say thank you for all of your effort and your diligence in bringing the situation to light. I think from what I've read previously and heard previously and what we've heard today, it sounds like if you didn't work as hard as you did, these activities could still be going on today. So I want to say thank you.
Thank you
for that. I think it's pretty clear to anyone who's been listening today who and what was responsible for those issues. So I'm going to skip past that aspect and maybe focus on, I think, the burning question for me, which is how on earth it went on for as long as it did so undetected. So you've talked a couple times today when you were going through your timeline about payroll not posted. So are you aware, were there safeguards present outside of the department that were designed to prevent the activity from either occurring in the first place or discovering the activity if it was occurring?
I don't believe there were. I don't believe there were. As I was speaking earlier, and I think it's important to understand, again, when I started asking these questions, and of course I went to the state auditor inspector's office, one of the things that can make this really easy to understand, okay? I've heard a lot of people say things about, well, what's happened? Where is this $30 million? You know, I mean, and I think those are great questions, you know, but I think it's easy to jump to a conclusion, and I can answer the question really, really clearly and easily for us. The Department of Health, you know, one thing I did hear in some of the previous testimony was that there were supplementary, quote, the term supplementary systems at agencies, supplementary to OMES. And I can tell you that our system at the Department of Health is not particularly supplementary. It's running all the general ledger detail for all the activity, okay? It's an old mainframe system. But that old mainframe system was one of the things that's helped us all put a stop to this. The control was built into that mainframe system to not allow posting to occur without sufficient cash in any area to post a cost. So that mainframe system was blocking this activity, and that's what was creating that payroll not posted. That mainframe system was the internal control that assisted in stopping and putting a halt to this activity. But essentially what occurs is that mainframe system reacts at a 26-digit level accounting code. So like we talked about the three funds, the federal fund, the state fund, and revolving fund, the three major funds which hold the dollars at OMES and the three major funds at the Department of Health. Well, those are matching funds, right? And the detail level is kept inside of those funds in that mainframe system at the Department of Health. The funds, when they are expended through OMES, are expended at the summary level only. Okay, so for instance, let's imagine that that I had a cost in a fund, and that cost was in program X, but within that fund I had dollars in program Y, right? Well, I could essentially borrow, right, in that fiscal system, the funds in that mainframe system, the funds from program Y down to program X, right? Because now there would be sufficient cash to expend my costs, right? So I've made a claim on that other program area's cash right within that fund, okay? But at the OMES side where the cash is kept, that cash is in a bin, like you reaching into a big bucket of water, okay? So it's not identifying that movement, you see? So you can see when that starts to occur, if that occurred over a long period of time, like my question was to my staff, well, you must have a credit facility somewhere. Well, sure, you just say there's a pile of cash sitting there. We can make the moves internally, but when the cash is expended, on the OMES side, it's expended at the summary level. Okay, so when the auditor comes and does the audit, and I think this is real relevant, I think, to understand. But when the auditor comes and does the audit, the auditor is looking at the activity within the system at the Department of Health. So I believe there was a question previously about, well, what should the auditor, was it legal? Do you think it was up to legal standards? I think that up to auditing standards, the auditing standards begin for federal grants and agreements at 2 CFR 200 and following. And those auditing standards say, hey, look, your audit has to be conducted in accordance with generally accepted government auditing standards, or what they call GAGS, okay? And in there, that is what we've probably all of us have commonly heard of, this thing called the Yellow Book, okay? So the Yellow Book talks about, you know, things that an auditor should be doing, okay? And if I may, I'd like to just tell you a couple of those things from the Yellow Book.
Briefly, because I'm running out of time.
Okay. It talks about information system controls being an integral part of an entity's internal control. So those information systems would be systems that you would check, not just for safety and security, but also for how the movement of transactions would occur.
So you seem to discover these issues pretty quickly upon your coming on the job. And upon discovering them, were you surprised that they weren't discovered previously, either just in routine fiscal management of the agency or audits or anything like that? Did that catch you off guard?
Yes, I was very surprised.
So I'm not an auditor in any sense, but help me understand. I mean, I know we've talked about a little bit the federal funds, and that's some of the misappropriation there. How does that, how is that obscured, I guess?
Can you clarify that a little bit?
I'm just trying to figure out, if we're auditing federal funds and we're misappropriating federal funds, where was the red flag?
Okay. I don't know if there was a red flag per se for the auditor. Like I said, if the auditor has a charge to understand through the auditing standards information systems. Okay, so I'll tell you, I'm not an auditor. Somebody that was a really sharp mentor once told me, if you ever take an executive finance position and you find yourself becoming one, you should run. Because one of the things that I quickly asked was, if you have unposted costs, if this system only receives postings if it has available cash, you have unposted costs where you've expended funds, then you have a credit facility somewhere. You have a line of credit somewhere. I mean, to me, that was very easy, elementary accounting stuff that any accounting person would have come up with. So then you chase the credit line, and then you find out, oh, okay, I understand. The dollars are sitting over here at the bank, and they're fungible, essentially. They are all the same thing. They're not specifically identifiable. So when the movement occurs, the dollars can go out as long as they're there. That's why these people, they didn't understand they were going to go bankrupt, but what they did understand is if they wanted something, they could probably pay for it.
So just as we're running out of time, I guess just in a broader sense, and this has been talked about in previous interviews, but and this goes a little bit to your opinion, so this is a little dicey but if you'll go with me there for a second. So I guess what I'm trying to figure out is that, are we as a state were we so severely lacking in safeguards and redundancies that things like not closing out payroll, or not closing out books, not posting payroll, misappropriating state and federal funds, were we so deficient in those safeguards that it just simply slipped through the cracks? Or did we have other entities, other agencies, other individuals that just simply missed it, that they weren't doing their jobs? That I think would help me out a lot.
It's both of those things. It's both of those things, because this system is deficient from the standpoint that it's not identifying federal funds where they're expended. It can't identify various state revolving funds where they're expended. Let's think of the industries boards. The industries boards, they pay money. Well, their money is being maintained by a system internally that we have, but it's sitting inside of a bucket, and when the expenditure occurs, the expenditure is occurring without regard to specific identification. Okay, from the standpoint of not catching it, or using the term caught, I believe that to plan and perform an audit, okay, and I'm not an auditor, I'm just a CPA that has been around this for a long time. These are specific guidance requirements that are very objective. Those guidance requirements tell you, do these things, look at these things, okay? In private industry, when an audit opinion is rendered that other folks rely upon, that are relied upon for the making of any kind of business deal or loans or banking or anything of that nature, when baseline requirements that should be met are not, people start looking for insurance. People start asking about the auditor's insurance. That's what happens. And these standards to understand, hey, from a financial, from an information system standpoint, how's that information system work? Okay, that is an objective requirement in auditing. It can be found in the yellow book. It can be found in this thing called the green book, which the green book is the follow-on to the yellow book, which says, hey, here's where internal controls come from if you're going to audit entities with respect to federal funds. And that stuff is objective. I'm not saying that based upon my opinion. Okay, so I would expect that the questions that I asked, if you have, do you have periods that are open, unclosed, internal periods that are unclosed and open? Yes. Do you have costs that are unposted then? Because if your periods are open, you must have some other problems. You probably have unposted costs. Yes. You've paid for those unposted costs. Yes. You must have a credit facility. Somewhere you have a line of credit. Yes. Not exactly, but yes. Well, then, you can find out what's happening very easily. What should happen is it should, from an audit perspective, that should be identified as an area of extreme control risk, and that area should be addressed. It would be a very, important area to address. It would probably cause a lot of issues and problems to address and make changes, but obviously, somebody very early on in the construction of that system should have addressed that. I've heard, people's attempts to blame the interim commissioner, and I don't believe that's fair. I believe that system was around before him. Somebody has to address that question, and that's a common logic set that you would go through in accounting in asking about that problem.
Thank you, Representative Caldwell. Representative Tadlock, you're recognized for 10 minutes.
1, 2. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for appearing here today. You've been, I appreciate all the information you've brought here. You've been very thorough, and I pretty much, you've explained it very well. And I can say that because I understand it. And for me to understand it, you must have done an excellent job. But anyway, one of the things that you said earlier, and maybe I misunderstood, but this goes back to Representative from District 8, said that as far as one of the questions, as far as someone directing them to move money out of a particular fund, that no one, to your knowledge, actually directed them to move money out of a fund over to another area that they weren't supposed to. Is that correct?
I would say, the general gist of that is correct. Obviously, if you confuse the nomenclature here, which is confusing, then the question and the meaning behind it can become somewhat obfuscated. And I say that because we're not particularly talking about moving money around from fund to fund. We're talking about the fact that costs, right, need to be expended from some component within a fund, right? So if one component has cash in the accounting record system and the component where the funds need to be expended don't have cash, they would need to internally borrow that, right, for the purpose of good reporting. But the cash sits over at OMES in a bucket. So that is irrelevant and completely tangential to the activity occurring within the system, because if you said, I have $100 over there in the bucket, then all I have to do is make appropriate movements internally to expend the $100. Do you see what I mean? So it's an important question that you're asking because it helps clarify and understand what happened here. So I don't think folks were saying, move funds around. Okay, I think that what was happening is these folks didn't even understand that they were going to go bankrupt with this methodology because they didn't understand how it worked. They just knew that if they wanted to do something, there was going to be money because there always had been.
And thank you for that. I'm still just a little bit confused, and I understand about the deficient system that exists and everything. I'm just still just kind of on the heels of that answer also. They may not have directed them to move that, but they certainly knew or aware that money was being moved around, that certainly had to have known that that money didn't exist.
I think they had been told many times that they were over budgeted, and they were over expending the funds that they had. I think they were well warned of that. I mean, I think they did not probably understand the accounting nuances of what was occurring, and I say this with one caveat to clarify this too for you and for this committee, and that is. There was questions about misappropriation and all that, all those issues, and where did the money go? And I would like to, again, I told you about the quality level of the staff that's serving the state at the Department of Health, but under a mandate to create an operational platform or essentially not be here because we're going to spend the money. What these folks were doing tediously was correctly booking any movements that occurred. Okay, so in other words, the dollars that were expended, they weren't expended for somebody that was taking trips or stealing it or anything like that. They were expended for public health activities, and these employees are excellent accountants that I'm very proud of, did a great job keeping track of those movements. So nothing's missing. They just burnt up the credit facility. So when the supplemental appropriation came, that money goes back in, and then what we're doing on the accounting side is putting the movements back so that the accounting system is righted again. But which brings another issue as far as tracing, is this traceable? If they use this money, are we going to be able to ever find out what happened? Absolutely. It was reported correctly internally in the system on the Department of Health, and it's absolutely traceable, and now it's being repaired by the fact that those funds, now that they go back into that bin, can now on the internal side of the Department of Health be properly reversed back to where they belong.
And thank you for that. And also, and just this will be probably my final, we're not, I know you're staying away from words where you're accusing people of doing things criminally, but also in one of your, and I don't have a copy of that with me right now, but on the timeline where you had written down here on, I believe, 9/14, where you had made contact, and it appears to me that you were being asked to do something that was not, that you wasn't supposed to be doing, basically, because of looking at your response to them, you were reminding them to do that would be in violation.
Absolutely. I wasn't particularly being asked, maybe somewhat asked, but not directly, because there was a report that was going to go to fiscal staff, and that report clearly delineated the fact that the agency was overexpended as to its annual appropriation by $10 million. Cox Kane, the senior deputy commissioner, and her assistant, Felicia Scanlon, the business planning director, changed that report to confuse that information to make that $10 million appear as though it was a part of a budget that was supported by revenue, a quote operating budget. Okay, so the question to me was, I think the charge was at first that I may provide this, and I think everybody figured out really quickly what I'm going to provide is the truth. It's going to reveal the $10 million to you all. Okay, and then the question back to me in the email was from Scanlon, were you okay with Julie's edits, Julie Cox Kane? And my answer was, see these two links. One is about position budgeting to your appropriation. The other is about unconstitutional debt for an agency.
And thank you. And then I thought that was going to be my final one. Then also, but because you hadn't been there very long, but some time had passed, several months. Had it become clear to you that this was kind of status quo there within that agency to run those things like that, and that perhaps maybe the reason you were being asked in 9/14 of 2017 to do those certain things?
Yes, sir, it was the status quo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yield the rest of my time to the chair.
2 minutes has been yielded to the chair. Representative Cleveland, you are recognized for 10 minutes.
Thank you. Is that on? Is that on?
If you'll let go of it, I think.
I did. Thank you, Mr. Romero, for. Testing.
If you hold it down.
Thank you, Mr. Romero, for
There you
being
go.
here. You have various different avenues of financial information, things that are coming into the county, to the state health department. Can you name the different agencies that pays money to the state health department?
Agencies that pay money?
Yes.
There's probably some flow through money. I mean, there's money that comes through the healthcare authority, but as far as any agencies paying money in particular, I mean, that would probably be a more detail level question for a staff member. I don't know if I necessarily have all of
Okay,
the.
you're the CFO, correctly?
Yes, sir.
Correct. Do you get money from the counties to reimburse salaries for state health employees? Or do you get money from the education department to reimburse
yes, sir.
salaries?
Those are millage funds from the counties. Yes, sir.
Can you explain to me, if you have an employee that gets terminated to save money, but yet that employee was being reimbursed to the health department from the ad valorem money to the state department, education to the state department. So how did that save the state of health department money?
Well, obviously, that wouldn't have saved the state health department money. So that's a good question. I think maybe the context to that question would be, why would a decision like that be made? And I would tell you that there are various complexities and nuances related to legal nuances related to a reduction in force plan, and all of the merit rules related to position bumping and so forth, with a reduction in force of classified employees. That by and large, that was not how the reduction in force was constructed. The reduction in force was constructed such that the agency would maximize its ability to obtain reimbursement through millage, and so that the agency would maximize its ability to not expend state appropriated dollars. I mean, but of course, within the contextual framework of a reduction in force plan, just like anything, I mean, there aren't right laws that come out of the place where y'all work, right? That
I
that
get
solve
what you're
every
saying. I
problem
don't have a
every
lot of time. So I'm asking you this question. You laid off people, not you, but the health department laid off people that was getting reimbursed. I'm asking the question, how can you make a claim that you're saving the state money if it wasn't costing the state health department any money?
Yeah, I never made that claim.
I didn't
though.
say you, I said the state
Okay.
health department.
Well, I don't believe that it is going to save the state
Thank
money
you.
when that happens.
All right. Has anyone at the state health department talked to you about your testimony today, go over it with you, speak about it at all?
No, sir.
Nobody.
No, in fact, I would tell you that that they were very, and when I say they, I mean Interim Commissioner Dorflinger and other senior leaders, the agency general counsel, were extremely respectful of the important implications of this proceeding.
Thank you. Well, and Mr. Dorflinger is your, I guess he'd be your supervisor or your boss?
That I don't think there's been a restructuring yet to make that occur. I think the Board of Health is going to be involved in that, but I think he's proposed that would be the future.
At what time, when all this was going on, did you actually meet with OMS concerning the funding issues?
Oh, it was sometime in the middle of October. Sometime toward the middle to end of October.
So when we met with the the COO, she said it was in September. So you guys are a month off. So she's wrong in what she said when y'all first brought this to her attention, brought this to the attention of OMS?
Well, I haven't had a chance to review her testimony, and my recollection of one of the meetings, I mean, we may have had more than one, right? My recollection of one of the meetings was that it was in October, close to the time, not too far from the time in which the resignations occurred.
On your board of commissioners, did they ever get involved in any of this at all?
The Board of Health?
Yes.
You know, I met with a couple of board members that did not constitute a quorum, and that's listed on this timeline. That was the point at which you know, there was some involvement. October 18th, I met off-site with 3 board members. But other than that, I don't have specific knowledge of their involvement with the problem.
Okay. Back during our special session, we were advised that the Board of Health needed $30 million to meet payroll. Or things are just going to go to hell in a handbasket, basically, is what we were told. And then all of a sudden, we give a $20,000 pay increase to Preston Dorflinger when we're laying people off, moving people around, and then we take money, also money that's in the state health department, to pay back to the OMS his salary that he incurred while he was there. Do you, as a CFO, do you not find it strange that you're giving a pay raise when you're laying people off at the same time?
You know, the only comment I can make to that is that if that is the direction of the Board of Health and they believe within, you know, the context of what's occurring and the requirements and regulations for that position and so on, if that's the decision that they've made, that's their decision. I mean, I don't particularly have a comment on that.
So as a CFO, that's just, you don't really care. You just do what they tell you.
Oh, I never said I didn't care. Obviously, if I
Do
did,
you care?
if I did what anybody told me, we wouldn't be sitting here right now, would we?
What I mean, are you concerned of a citizens of Oklahoma that we would take and give a $20,000 pay increase to someone who other people are being laid off?
As a citizen, I could understand somebody being concerned. I think the interim commissioner, though, has done a far better job than what was previously done in giving me the opportunity to help the agency right itself. So I think the citizens could take that into consideration as well.
Representative Cleveland, you have time for one more question.
Thank you.
One more nice question.
Mr. Romero, I'm sorry?
You're recognized for one more question.
He used the word nice.
I'm being nice,
I think you are too.
but I don't have a lot of time, and you kind of talk too long.
I'm sorry.
You mentioned your 20-year system of.
Doing my best.
You mentioned your 20-year-old system, your computer system.
Well, I think it's about 35, 6, 7 years old.
Okay, 35, 36, 7. But yet you've paid $23 million to OMS the past few years to upgrade that system. Do you ever questioned where that $23 million went?
Oh, I don't believe we've paid $23 million to upgrade the system. I believe that we have paid money.
You paid $23 million, I know that.
Within what period of time?
Last 6 years?
To OMES?
Yes, sir.
Well, we've paid a lot more money than that to OMES over the
State
last
money.
6 years. Yeah, I don't know what the state money amount is, but we've paid quite a bit of money to OMES over the last 6. I mean, our master service agreement is about $600,000 a month, so it would be $7.2 million a year just for the consolidation agreement.
My point is, what have you got for that money if you got a 30-year-old plus system?
That's a good question. I don't have a specific rendering of the information technology project platform today with me.
I'd like to give my good questions, nice questions to Representative Calvi if there's any time left.
There's no time remaining. Representative Condit, you're recognized for 10 minutes of nice questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot of the things that I was going to ask has already been gone over, and one of them has to do with financial statements. I'm just kind of dumbfounded. I am not an accountant. I am not an attorney. I come from a public school background, retired public educator. But you have already alluded to OMES basically had like 3 pots, and they would distribute the money to the health department. So if the health department had known, according to the report that was filled out and given to us, there are no current financial statements, there were no prior period financial statements. Did OMES maintain any financial statements?
I don't know what OMES does. I mean, we have a consolidated annual financial report for the state of Oklahoma. So, I'm not particularly familiar with how they maintain their financial statements. I know, at the CAFR level, the agency activities typically, eliminated as to the total state's activities. But I don't know what OMES particularly does for their financial statements.
Okay. I think my good friend from Slaughterville here already mentioned that Ms. Nichols testified that OMES met with the health department in September and advised using federal funds and pay it back later. Did y'all call OMES in, or do you know?
Well, that maybe that'll help clarify the question that Mr. Cleveland had asked about when the dates of the meetings were, because there was more than one meeting. So, yeah, I believe that probably happened in September. But yes, there were some budget folks from OMES. We were discussing with those people, Senior Deputy Commissioner Cox Kane, Deborah Nichols, the Chief Operating Officer, and I was in that meeting. And we were discussing with them the possibilities of addressing a cash shortfall if payroll could not be met, because at that point we were already producing the internal cash report, which specifically identified restricted funds. And the 2 people from OMES had mentioned as an option, well, maybe you could use these funds and pay them back later. Yes.
Okay. From my perspective as a legislator, some of the important things for the health department is, say, maintaining the care needed for the least of the Oklahoma citizens that can afford it, sooner care for kids in our state, care for our elderly. In your opinion, do you see the cuts that have been put in place and the layoffs taken into consideration? Are those areas being impacted so negatively that it will have a negative effect on our citizens?
Sure. I mean, those reductions could have negative impact upon the system, but from a 50,000-foot view, in my opinion, as you pull out and you're talking about financial issues, right? One of the things that is very important is that there's enough money for that agency to continue to fulfill its core functions, and the amount of time that there's been a poor budgeting platform, that there's been misuse of the dollars that were being held at OMES for the agency as a credit line. It's going to take quite a bit of hard work to right that ship and to come in the next budget year and address public health concerns by priority, by determining service delivery and comparing that to available dollars. And of course, a lot of that will have to do, with matters related to the state appropriation. We're facing a reduction. So yes, I agree. But I think that the more salient issue here is, why is that happening? It's happening because there was a massive degree of mismanagement that overexpended $30 million. And now, there are limited resources available to the state, and something has to be done for this agency to accommodate that now. So yeah, we're all very disappointed. I'm disappointed, and I don't think there's anybody at the Department of Health. We've got a lot of dedicated public servants, and everybody's disappointed.
Okay, I'm going to combine my last 2 questions together. When will you see a 3-year strategic plan available for public inspection? And what is your recommendation for us for a more accountable, open system of accounting for the agency?
It's a great question. Currently in the corrective action report, one of the things that that I have put forth that as very important is to develop a budget call process for a 3-year operational period where the programmatic areas of the agency will be properly analyzed as to their service delivery against available dollars, where executive decisions can be made about how the service delivery will occur in conjunction with the relationship with our state's leadership. So, you know, the lawmakers and so forth. So that's going to happen, and we're working very diligently on it right now, even with the limited capacity we have, because we only have a mainframe system. We don't have a common enterprise resource planning system that you'd find out there that can sometimes be a lot easier to use to set up a 3-year plan. I am going to direct that, and I'm going to make sure that we have it and we provide it and we're able to manage it effectively pursuant to our available resources. My recommendation as to how we do this in future years, or what should happen. I mean, obviously, there's a great deal of reform required because we're talking about a large amount of federal dollars, besides the dollars that are sitting in those pots of money that are dollars that are part of the various industries in this state. So, you know, we need to find a way to, within this accounting system, for all of these systems to match up exactly as they report, the same way that they expend. Okay, that's a tall order right now, but one of the reasons that I was very vocal when this got started is because I understand and recognize that the citizens of our state are relying upon these services. I understand and recognize that there are, like I said, a large amount of federal funds flowing into the state by means of the taxpayers and so forth that expect results and expect us to be cognizant of our fiduciary responsibility in dealing with that. So I believe that there will be a great deal of reform required to say, hey, we've got to figure out how is this going to match up. There needs to be some reform required in how we address our auditing performance, and you know what kind of funds are available. You know, I'm not here to pick on the state auditor inspector. I mean, there's not a lot of money going there. You know, when an auditor gets a very meager salary to do that work, I would imagine that they might work there for some training and move on. You know, I'm used to dealing with auditors that come in, they've seen you for 3 or 4 years, they figure out exactly how your operations work, and, you know, nothing will ever get by them. You know, so there are some things that from a reform standpoint will need to occur, most definitely.
Well, I do appreciate your time. I'm sure I don't have much time left, do I? I was going to yield it to the chair.
1 minute will be yielded to the chair. Representative Hall, you're recognized for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Romero, for taking time to come and visit with us. And I've said this to every person that's come in and chatted, is we're not here necessarily to point blame, but we're looking for ways to find solutions so that this doesn't ever happen to health or to any other state agency, because we want to be good stewards of the taxpayer dollars. So first off, to your knowledge, is there or was there a culture of silence or intimidation or covering up of information regarding finances or inefficiencies within the health department?
Absolutely.
Did you ever feel intimidated or felt like your job was threatened for communicating or coming forward with any of these issues?
No, I'm a difficult person to intimidate, so no.
Who was your direct supervisor?
Deborah Nichols, the former chief operating officer of the agency.
And I know you just came on in in April, but who hired you? I mean, what was the hiring process that you went through?
The hiring process was 2 or 3 interviews. There was a committee, but Deborah Nichols was driving the questioning during those interviews.
Would you say that's normal in a traditional operations that the CFO would report to the COO?
Not particularly. I mean, typically you're going to have a pretty direct interaction with the chief executive officer, and have probably accessibility to the board, maybe a dotted line to the board.
And so from your statements regarding the timeline, it sounds like you didn't have much interaction at all with Klein and not much interaction with Cox Kane as well.
Not for the first few months. Not until I was pushing very hard that something needed to be done about the finances.
And have you identified when this issue really started to take place? I mean, you obviously noticed it when you first started, but it appears that this has gone on for much longer and you just started shedding light on it. Do you know when it began?
I don't know exactly when it began, but from the study that I've done, I could see that probably at least the two prior fiscal years were over budgeted, and the line of credit type of activity was how that was maintained and accommodated, obviously causing you to end up in a position where those cash dollars over time continue to dwindle.
Do you know of anybody prior to you? I mean, Deborah Nichols has come and spoken with us, and so we heard her testimony. But prior to you, were there other people in your position that tried to shine light on this, or were they intimidated and felt like they couldn't say anything?
I am not particularly knowledgeable about those people. This would just be simply hearsay to tell you that, the entire financial staff has pretty much let me know that when there were good people, they were run off pretty summarily by the people who were in charge that resigned.
You also mentioned that Scanlon was the assistant to Cox Kane. Is that her? What was her exact role?
Her title was the business planning director.
And she worked hand in hand with Cox Kane as...
She would refer to Cox Kane as, quote, my boss. There's an executive suite in the at the Department of Health where, she had an office adjacent to Cox Kane. I was not part of that executive suite of offices, nor was Deborah Nichols.
And Deborah Nichols' position as CFO or COO hasn't been replaced. Is that correct?
Her position was replaced.
And so at this point, do you report to that person, or who do you report to currently?
At this point, I don't believe that the organizational structure has been changed. I believe that's something to do with, matters related to the Board of Health. It has been proposed in the corrective action report that the chief financial officer would report to the commissioner.
I know in private business and then also in the public sector, oftentimes people in similar positions will get together and have associations with other people in similar positions. Do you get together with other CFOs of other state agencies to talk about common practices or best practices within their agencies?
I've discussed it a little bit, and I've even discussed the possibility of arranging a group like that with another CFO. But with a couple of them, but we haven't done that yet, and to my knowledge, it does not exist. I think it's a good idea to have some kind of peer network like that.
And thank you so much for your time, and we appreciate you spending time with us today. I'll yield the balance of my time to the chair.
4 minutes to the chair. Representative Calvi. You are recognized for 11 minutes.
That on at this point? Yes, thank you. Mr. Romero, we've heard with a recent witness that there is an investigation going on jointly by the FBI and the State Attorney General and perhaps some other federal agencies. Have you been contacted with regard to this investigation?
Yes, I have. I've been informed that I will be meeting with the FBI.
Have you had any contact prior to that time with any federal agency regarding any of these matters that you've testified about today?
I have had contact with the Health Resources Services Administration.
Okay, and that's, I think you referenced that in your timeline. Is that November 14th, I think, if I recall your testimony earlier.
Well, I'll have to look at the timeline and tell you that.
While you're looking at that, have you been instructed by anybody? You mentioned you weren't instructed by anybody at the Department of Health about your testimony today. Have you been instructed by anybody else not to provide any documents or testify with regard to any matter?
No, I have not been instructed of that.
You, to follow up on some earlier questions, you have referenced in your timeline on October 23rd a meeting with Roy Garcia and Matt Clarkson of OMES. You, in response to questions from other members a moment ago, you said that there may have been earlier meetings with OMES personnel, correct?
Yes, just like I said, that September meeting that the Chief Operating Officer, Deborah Nichols, was talking about.
Okay. And she testified that during that meeting that two senior level OMES people, I don't know if instructed is the right word, or instructed or suggested that payroll be paid out of federal funds. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And what was your response?
Absolutely not.
Good for you. You mentioned earlier about this distinction between the supplemental system, kind of an older system that you had that wouldn't allow matters to be posted unless there were funds available, versus the information that was provided to OMES through their system, their very costly system, I think as Representative Cleveland alluded to earlier. Does that system through which items are reported to OMES, does that allow postings that there aren't cash available for?
I'll clarify by saying that, again, it's difficult because if the question can confuse what really happens, because the system at the Department of Health is not a supplemental system. That's the system which contains the general ledger type of activity that has all the particular expenditures by programmatic area. Those expenditures are maintained in that system by a 16-digit, by a 26-digit structure, which contains the fund structure, the account structure, a sub-account, and object of expenditure code. At the OMES level, the funds are expended at the just summary fund level. So there's no programmatic identification within the expenditure of those funds on the OMES side.
Okay, so and I appreciate the clarification, but to boil down to it, the system by which things are reported to OMES does not necessarily preclude a posting that would be caught, if you will, as you suggested, the older system that the Department of Health uses does catch. Is that correct?
I'm kind of not understanding what you exactly mean by the question. I want to make sure I can answer it correctly.
No, that's fair enough. Okay, so you testified a little bit ago that in describing the 35-year-old system that the Department of Health uses, which you've described as the main system actually, 26-digit structure system, that system does not allow one to actually post an expense on it unless the funds are available, correct?
Yes, unless there's cash available.
Okay. And you, I think, even described in your earlier testimony that, therefore, it's a good thing that system was in place because they caught some of those things and made it available once somebody was willing to look at it, like yourself, when you came on board, that enabled you to see that, correct?
Yes, sir.
So why didn't OMES catch that earlier? That's my question.
Okay, that's a great question, and that goes to what I said earlier, and that is they're not really particularly in a position to catch it because the funds are only expended at a summary level. So it would be tantamount to saying, I have all the record keeping here, right? But if you're my cash steward and I tell you, hey, expend $50, okay? You're expending $50 without the knowledge of my particular programmatic detail record here. You're expending $50, but pretend you had a suitcase of $1 bills. You could pull out any 50 $1 bills and expend the $50. Well, that's how that system works.
Okay, and that's the same system that's in place for every other state agency, correct?
Yes, sir.
Is that PeopleSoft?
Yes, sir.
And how much do we spend for that?
I don't know how much we spent for PeopleSoft. That was long before my time.
Okay. You mentioned earlier about 2 CFR 200, which would be, for those of us who aren't lawyers, maybe listening, that would be a second volume of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 200 et sequentia, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and does that apply to, is that an auditing standard or is that more of a reporting or accounting standard?
Which standard? The whole section itself?
Yes.
The section itself is entitled Grants and Agreements, and that section refers you to, or 200-514 of that section says, the audit must be conducted in accordance with GAGAS, Generally Accepted Governmental Auditing Standards.
Okay, and you're aware that there are different types and levels of audits. Obviously, as a CPA and attorney, you would be. There's financial statement audits. There's different ways, I'm sure, of categorizing it, but one way it's been suggested earlier was financial statement audits, then a little bit more in-depth performance audits, and then perhaps the most scrutinizing would be one that's meant to develop evidence for a court of law. That type of in-depth forensic audit. Was the audit that you're referring to here, what level of audit is that?
That audit relates to the annual
the CAFR?
A133
Oh,
audit,
A133.
which becomes obviously components of the CAFR, and that audit operates with respect to expenditure of federal funds.
Okay. And you're aware that there are different time frames for instance, the CAFR audit versus the single audit on federal funds, correct?
Sure.
Okay.
I think there's actually inside this book, there is the engagement letter for that audit.
Yeah, thank you. And I do appreciate greatly your timeline here, and I assume from that you are, as would be expected from a CPA and attorney, a meticulous record keeper. And if need be, if we needed to refer back to time frames, for instance, for this September meeting with senior OMES officials and things like that, you'd be able, if need be, to provide your schedule or things like that with regard to this.
Sure.
Okay.
Absolutely. Although I would tell you, some of these meetings, like I said in my testimony, there were constant meetings over and over again about where the cash was going to come from. Sometimes I was just being hailed into those meetings at the last minute, so they may not necessarily be on my schedule.
I understand. And I appreciate your candor earlier about, and I do appreciate also the fact that responding to a subpoena of this nature, while routine at the congressional level has only just now been started here at the state of Oklahoma with regard to our legislature. I realize that that's more than what people are used to accommodating here. And you were very forthright in that not all the documents requested you were able to provide at this time. And I appreciate your candor about that. But if need be, you'd be able to, if we had further questions and things like that, and I'm sure that our chairman would be willing to work with you, you'd be able to provide other documents that would respond to that subpoena, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and also, as we've seen, particularly with Representative Cleveland's questions and things, we are very limited in the amount of time we're allowed here, and I appreciate the need to have meetings run on some sort of schedule, but you'd be able and willing to come back and testify further if we have further questions, correct?
Yes, I would.
Representative Calvi, you have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, there's this question about where did the money go? Okay, and I realize that it's kind of like somebody who just overdraws maxes out a credit card without being able to pay it, having a line of credit, effectively, as you put it. But were some of the items, we've learned recently about layoffs in terms of functions like restaurant inspections and other functions like that at the Department of Health, but they were spending money on stuff like lights on jogging trails and things like that, correct?
I'm not aware of them spending money for lights on jogging trails.
Okay.
I mean, it's possible. I mean, I'm not aware of every expenditure they had, so I'm not aware of that particularly at this point in time.
Okay. You testified earlier about that these funds would be traceable, and that there had been a false report proposed to be sent to the legislature, to which you very rightly objected, about $10 million discrepancy in the funding that ended up being more than that even, but that the former leadership at the Department of Health was wanting to report that as if it were all things within their operating budget that they had previously disclosed to the legislature. Do you recall that?
Right, like it was an operating budget, yeah.
Right. So in other words, there were things outside the operating budget that money had actually been expended on, correct?
No, that money was actually, I mean, that's just nomenclature they used to kind of smush over that report, to not have it, be noticeable like I had made it. Those were extended public health programs, that payroll not posted. By the majority of it was from our activity 75, which is community and family health. So no, the majority of it, I mean, for everything that I can see at this point in time, it's not like those funds were going for things that did not relate to things related to public health. At some level, they were just over expenditures that were funded by the fact that there was a bucket of money to be able to utilize to pay the bills for a while until the bucket ran dry.
Okay. So they just went to the well too often.
That's right.
Representative Calvi, your time has expired. Thank you. Vice Chairman Downing, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Romero, thank you for coming today, and we're almost to the end. I'll go, and then the chairman will wrap up, and appreciate you coming. I think everything we've heard from everyone who's talked, everything I've heard publicly has really highlighted you as being an example of the person in the middle of this scenario who stood strong, spoke up, and was doing an outstanding job. So I want to thank you for that, and your role and your place of employment, being willing to come and talk to us here today. And so I greatly appreciate that, your service to our state. So I want to pick up where Representative Calvi left off. You were talking about where did the money go. We have heard about maybe there was mission creep. I think there was recently a news report about programs. There were good programs. Maybe they were, some of the programs even the governor liked. But we also had in testimony here before a lot about IT, that IT was a very expensive thing that grew exponentially. Could you speak to that? Was IT a cost of an expense in your agency that you saw as being problematic that led to some of this overspending?
Well, one of my early questions, and it's a question I had since I started, and it's part of the corrective action report, was just that the agency would identify in its budget personnel costs or full-time equivalents, and then non-personnel costs, and separately identify those by program area for an upcoming budget year to be able to say these are true allocable costs to this program area that the agency can bear within the framework of the available dollars it has. One of the things that I saw very early on when I started was the fact that there was quite a bit of money being expended for information technology, and really the poor planning on how that was going to be paid for. The other thing that I saw was, and and have seen that, projects have been undertaken and then, later on undertaken without a purchase order and ratifications occurring afterwards, and people coming to me and saying, well, we started this project. This project was already started and, funds have already been expended, so you're going to have to keep paying for it. And of course, my question is if we haven't particularly analyzed the budget to determine whether or not we can sustain those costs, we need to stop. And one of the things that we're doing right now is a complete analysis of outstanding information technology projects and whether or not we have actual funding for them, not whether or not they're just budgeted.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that, everyone, there's nothing bad about IT inherently, or even a lot of good programs like you mentioned. It's just that, did we have the money allocated for it? So with that, does the agency itself start out from the outset and say, okay, here's the amount of money we're going to allocate for IT, or is there an amount that's actually given to you that you're billed for in a different way that comes in, then you have to address it in that regard?
The agency budgets information technology costs, but, again, pursuant to the entire discussion we've had here today, obviously those budgets have been somewhat meaningless. So probably very meaningless, So I would tell you that on the average over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, the budget's been somewhere around $25 to $30 million, $20 to $30 million, and somewhere in total for the agency over the last 4 or 5 years, it's been about $25 or $30 million. So I know it's affected the agency's ability to cash flow when we combine the fact, obviously, that we have issues related to payroll as well. That's why it's premature for somebody without financial reporting, without proper budgetary controls in place to say, well, this has occurred because there's too much IT costs. It is relevant, though, to say the only way you can construct a budget in this environment is to say, okay, let's take the largest costs that we have and let's separate them by programmatic area, and let's say we're going to develop a budget that shows personnel costs and non-personnel costs by program area, and we're going to determine whether or not we can fund these program areas pursuant to their requests, right, and the things that they want to do. And then, of course, what executive and obviously places like this body have in mind with those communications for what service delivery should look like for an agency. So it's gonna take some work. I mean, the budget process needs to be overhauled, and there has been a lot of money spent on information technology. There's no doubt about that. Like I said before, there's a monthly cost to a master service agreement that is in the neighborhood of about $600,000 a month. Besides other projects and so on that, projects that have federal funding for information technology. So, it's easy to get confused about these numbers, and I'm telling you that we'd have to go back and say, hey, if you have, 20 projects and you say there's federal funding, what's your requirement, your maintenance of effort cost on this project? And then you have to take them all once you look at your, decisions about how you're going to operate and deliver your services. What do we do on the whole in the aggregate, and to look at the amount of money we have available to maintain the effort on those projects. So, in other words, it'd be real easy for people to say, oh, I have, this is federally funded, and you start doing that over and over again, right? Well, if you have 10 projects and you have to maintain $10 of effort, right, for the 10 projects, and it's going to cost you $100, and you only have $50 that you're going to be able to apply to that, then you're going to put yourself in a budget shortfall really quickly. And that's one of the things that needs to be examined as we roll forward here in constructing these budgets properly.
So on the personnel, having additional personnel, that's been one of the areas that they've cut back with the RIF. On the salaries, were there other, I know someone made an issue of the director's salary, but have other salaries changed as a part of the transition within the agency? Have there been other pay increases?
I think there have been a few pay increases. Yes, I believe there have been.
Okay. And so is that also the board's decision on those?
I don't believe that the other pay increases are particularly the board's decision.
Okay.
I haven't had one.
Okay. So personnel costs, they cut back on that. It doesn't sound like there's been a great deal of salary increases. So it sounds like they're cutting back on personnel costs. On the IT, I saw in the recommendation, so these, I'm just mentioning it because we had, I think it was the chief operations officer that highlighted IT as such a big part with personnel. And so that's why I'm looking at both. On the IT, I actually saw in the recommendation to add some IT, and I know sometimes IT can add efficiencies. But have you seen anywhere that we are cutting back on IT in the agency to rein in some of those costs? Has that begun to occur
I have
at
not
all?
seen that yet, but like I said, I have been given the platform to be able to develop these budgets by program area, separating personnel and non-personnel costs, and we have bandied that discussion about in order to develop an analysis of existing projects, whether or not we have the actual funding to be able to maintain those projects, as well as looking at those projects for their ongoing requirements as far as maintenance and so forth.
Okay.
So that's occurring right now. That's a big job, because remember, it's never happened, right? So like everything else, we're doing a whole lot of work as fast as we can.
Well, thank you for that. So those are kind of, and my line of questioning is, where did the money go? What happened in this kind of snapshot like we've been talking about? But then I'm going to move to kind of how we prevent that. So going along, those were kind of the expenses. Now, when they were going to get the money, you said that largely what you referred to, it really is like a line of credit, was the Ryan White Fund. And so you kind of point to that as this is kind of how they kept things afloat. So when we're taking, and you've answered this some, but try to help me understand a little bit more. When we're taking money from that fund and using it, whether it's for additional personnel or IT or whatever it is, do you have to actually designate that personnel or a percentage of that personnel as being in a federal role of some type in order to use those federal dollars? Is that typically how it would work?
Yes.
Like say 25% or 50%?
Sure, because at the end of the day, it's a reimbursement agency, right? So you're asking a really good question, because it has to do, this dovetails a lot with what happened to the money, or how did this happen, right? So you once that time is verified, then there's going to be a determination whether or not that time was an allowable cost under federal grant related funds, right? Yep. So one of the things that happened here, I'll answer really clearly about how you go bankrupt. Well, when you're operating in any entity on a line of credit, typically you're doing that because you're producing some product or service, and during the course of producing that product or service, you're fronting costs to create that until you realize the sale of that, at which time you're able to then get your revenue and cash flow to restore your line of credit, and you continue operating like that. Well, if you take the fact that that mainframe system would not let payroll be posted if the sufficient cash did not exist, right? Then what's really happening? We can't really post that cost we've incurred or we've fronted. In other words, our work in process or our product or service is really the personnel. So that cost has now been fronted, and now because we can't record it, we can't go out and get reimbursed for it. So what's really happening is, just like a line of credit, and that's why I use that to describe it, you're clawing into that line of credit without a way then to be able to restore it. So as you fall further and further behind, you can't get your reimbursement to occur quickly enough. That occurred with federal grants. That occurred out in the counties with millage. Okay, so then you've absorbed that cost and you've fronted that with this credit line, and you haven't realized the revenues that you need, essentially like any business would need to be able to put the credit line back. So you can see what would happen as that begins to happen. It's that mainframe fiscal system that essentially forces you to burn up that line of credit and fall off the cliff and start going bankrupt. And that's the complexity, that's the little nuance, I believe, that the people that were running the agency didn't understand was happening.
Well, it seems to me that, for example, the Ryan White Fund, if the person, I think we've also heard that there wasn't central finance necessarily in the agency, that it was kind of decentralized and no one got a full broad picture. So I think that's one takeaway for me, is that as an agency, you need one central view that can see all these different funds and where they're supposed to be and where they're not supposed to be. So you mentioned on August 11, looking at your timeline, and this goes back to then how do we prevent this from happening in the future, that from then on it kind of became this conversation once you highlighted, hey, we're behind the curve, and it was, well, how do we find the cash? Where do we find the cash? Or this hope that there would be cash. And you talk about adjusting some legislative reports and requests. It was a part of the cash that they were hoping to get in the form of supplementals from the legislature, by maybe saying they're underfunded. Was that a part of, we're going to get enough infusion from a legislative supplement to keep us floated?
No, that was never even considered. In fact, it was the chief operating officer, Deborah Nichols, that said, you're going to need to go ask for a supplemental appropriation to these people that were leaders, the senior deputy commissioner and the commissioner, and these people were flatly refusing that. It's, essentially all part of that component we're not telling.
Okay. So they actually did not want to ask for a supplemental because they thought it might expose.
Absolutely. It sure appeared like that to me.
Okay. So when you went and you finally had a conversation, I think it was with Klein, you had mentioned, I think, to other employees that something could be criminal. It was recommended to you to go to the Office of Accountability, which my understanding is the Office of Accountability, that was really the only person that had a direct line to the board. And you said, basically you were like, this would be ridiculous for me to go to the Office of Accountability to talk about this. Why did you feel that way?
Well, I mean, I knew at that point that we were already very far down the road on things. And I had already been to the state auditor and inspector's office. I had already had multiple meetings where I've informed them of these problems, right? I've made very clear implication to the Board of Health about the problems. And at that point, I'm thinking, well, what's this person talking about, going to the Office of Accountability Systems? I mean, I had even spoken with the then Office of Accountability Systems Director, Jay Holland, and I'd have several conversations with him about what was going on. And he was in a similar position, not quite sure how to handle it.
So Jay Holland was the Office of Accountability, but wasn't he also considered the internal auditor? Wasn't that part of his kind of dual role?
I don't think the office was. I think Jay Holland was fulfilling dual roles.
Dual roles. Okay. So a part of that, you're saying he has some concerns. Well, one of the ideas as a committee, and we're looking for legislative answers to this, is do you think it would have been helpful if Jay Holland or whoever was fulfilling that role of an independent auditor, the accountability, and I'll throw in general counsel. You mentioned the former general counsel, not the current one, maybe wasn't giving you the type of information or advice you expected. If all of those entities, auditors, general counsel, the Officer of Accountability, if they had an independence outside of your agency leadership, do you feel like when you went to them that you would have got a better response and better help?
Something along those lines, I'm sure would have helped. I mean, there was a lot of control over too many people, and I think, they were just living within an enterprise where they wanted their jobs and statutory authority to go contact, somebody else. And Mr. Holland was very concerned because there's an internal administrative policy that says that anything that OAS director would want to do to consult with somebody else would have to first go through the commissioner. So the agency had really confused the ability and really cornered folks into not having the ability to get out elsewhere. That's why I went through the SAS 99 process, because it was within the audit, it was correct, it was professionally correct, and that's why I notified them that I would do that.
Okay. I asked when Preston Dorflinger was before Secretary of Finance, acting director there now, I said, who would you recommend to come in and visit with our committee? He named you specifically. And so, of course, that's a large part why we reached out to you. And so I just want to thank you for being willing to do that and come here today. And so I would ask you maybe the same thing. Is there anybody or anything else that we should be asking, or anyone else we should talk to? Do you feel like we've got a pretty good picture to move on and look at recommendations as a committee? I mean, based on the information you've given us here today, how do you feel about that? Do we need to is there somebody else you'd recommend we need to talk to?
I think these can appear to be very complex issues to understand. So, if there are more questions, I'd be willing to help. I mean, I think all the information has been provided to you, the relevant information. I think that there's probably not particularly a person right now that's going to provide more information. I think understanding it, it could maybe there's more assistance that could be provided there, because this is I've had several months to look at this and work with it, and it's a very difficult thing for an accounting person to understand. How did all this stuff happen? So I don't expect somebody that's a non-accountant to instantly grasp it, but I do think that there are some easily relevant takeaways. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that is obviously there's a problem with how we're looking at this stuff from an auditor's perspective. I'm not going to criticize the auditor, but I don't know if there are funds available for the kind of folks that probably the level of maybe the level to expand that or provide opportunities for people to be able to stay there long term and learn the agencies and be able to get in there and watch the stuff year over year. I mean, that would be very helpful. And I think as far as the reporting systems, it's important to realize that these aren't particularly supplemental systems. I mean, our agency system's not a supplemental system. That's where the reporting activity is occurring. The dollars are being expended at a summary level out of Office of Management and Enterprise Services. So that type of system, I know there's already been discussions and people are talking about how to make system improvements, but that type of system will need a lot of improvement because there are a lot of federal funds flowing through that system, and I would imagine that would be very, very important with respect to those federal funds.
Well, Mr. Mayor, I want to thank you. Thank you for helping at the Department of Health and continuing to be there and put it on a good footing. And also, we're going to learn a lot, I think, that'll be helpful as a state. And so just appreciate you. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Vice Chairman. Mr. Romero, I'm the one you've been looking for. This shouldn't last too much longer. We'll only go to about 8:30 or 9. So
I'm ready for it. Go ahead.
No bathroom breaks.
Bring me food.
There you go. No, I will echo the thoughts of my colleagues in giving my appreciation to you for appearing here today and your willingness to do so and your detailed information. If I could just start real quick by cleaning up a couple things that I just need some clarification on the questions that were asked earlier by different members, and then I'll have a little bit of a line of questioning for you after that. You mentioned that there is currently, obviously, Deborah Nichols was the former COO. She resigned, and you mentioned that a new COO has been hired. Is that correct?
Yes.
And who is the new COO?
Kim Bailey.
Kim Bailey. And when was she hired?
Oh, within the last 30 days, I
Okay.
imagine.
Okay. And then also to clarify on the line of question that Representative Calvi and a few others had, talking about the direction from, or not direction, but the wording that Ms. Nichols used was a recommendation from OMES to use federal funds, commingling some of those federal funds to help payroll and put the funds and then put the funds back later. And in her testimony, in the documentation that she provided to us, the fund that she references Fund 400. Do you, off the top of your head, know what Fund 400 is?
Yes, that's the federal fund. So remember I said that on the Department of Health side, the funds exist at a 26-digit level.
Right.
Well, the first 3 digits identify the federal fund, the 400 level fund, the revolving funds. Those are the 210 level funds, the 200 level funds, and then the state appropriated funds, which start with a 19, and the third digit would be the fiscal year.
Sure. And the reason I asked that is just to clear up, because I've heard some possible confusion, when we start talking about the Ryan White funds that were used, that the Fund 400 fund might actually be the Ryan White funds, and we're talking about just a larger fund that consists of all the federal funds that are brought into the agency, correct?
Well, the 400 fund does have all the federal
Right.
funds that were brought into the agency. So, but I would tell you that they're all lumped together, so they are commingled there. So you could have within the 400 fund at OMES, you could have 18 different federal grant programs, and those would all have different revenue sources on the Department of Health side. On the OMES side, that class fund or that 400 fund would have the same department number for every one of those 18 different federal funds. So they'd be completely unidentifiable on the OMES side.
Well, that answer leads directly into a little bit of a line of questioning. You mentioned you've mentioned several times the lack of uniformity in reporting between OMES and the agency level. So, particularly for the agency that you're in, OSDH. And I think part of the reason why this committee is so concerned about that and continues to ask questions about that, and recently announced that we're expanding to a couple other agencies that we're going to start looking into, is because it's alarming for us, for me in particular, and I think I can say that the members of this committee are concerned that just simple practice, accounting practices just haven't been uniform from the OMES to the state agency level. And you went into a little bit of detail in talking about the daily cash report that you started putting together. And to your recollection, that was the first time OSDH had put together anything of that, which was of your doing. Is that correct?
To my knowledge, that's the first time.
Are you aware of any other agencies that do or do not do a similar practice, like a daily cash report?
I wouldn't be aware of whether or not they do that. I mean, the only thing I'm aware of is like I said, the expenditure of funds on the OMES side occurs at the summary level only.
Gotcha. Well, and for us, it just continues to beg the question, where else is it happening, and in what other state agencies is it happening? Because we've heard your testimony as well as other testimonies on the borrowing, the commingling. On the IT side, as Representative Downing pointed to, and as you mentioned, a lack of business planning, just ensuring that there's a business plan in place. And in fact, Ms. Nichols gave documentation that there was no vested interest at the OMES level to control IT costs, and that was the agency's responsibility. Would you say that is the characterization coming from OMES for OSDH as well?
I don't particularly know OMES's characterization of it. I mean, I know that the budgetary planning has been very, very poor. So, obviously being able to determine whether or not those costs can be paid for. I mean, in any type of, acquisition strategy where you're utilizing something that's beneficial to your entity, right, you're going to have to figure out whether or not you have, a return on investment for the dollars that you're expending with dollars that are being expended for things like information technology. You typically in a business environment need some way that you can follow a project management plan, follow the verification of the deliverables. You'd probably want some type of verification that you knew the deliverables that you were paying for or what you actually got. I mean, there's a lot of work there that probably some of it may relate to the fact I don't know how old this relationship is. I mean, I know there was a consolidation that occurred several years ago, so there's some work that needs to be done that would be part of a normal business relationship if you were having any type of shared service. I mean, if you work in industry and there's a home office that's providing shared services, I mean, there's a business planning activity that occurs with respect to the benefit of those services and whether or not it's worth it to use it like that or to procure those services outside, or all of those things go to return on investment analyses that typically are conducted. And I'm not knowledgeable about whether or not that's occurred here. I mean, obviously the very poor business planning is obviously indicia of the fact that there's not a whole lot of oversight as to what's happening with this. I don't know what's been done about that in the past, but I know right now we have to examine our ability to fund those costs.
Right, and for the accounting level, if OMES proposes either through the shared services agreement that you've talked about with the approximately $600,000 a month that OSDH pays out, or any other additional projects that OMES would present to the State Department of Health, if there is not as we've said, a business plan presented with that, does the agency have the ability, does OSDH have the ability to deny that request, or does that happen regardless? And does the agency have any say over that?
I don't know what the formalized history of that has been. I know that there was a time a few years back when there was there had been some pursuit of a new financial system for the Department of Health. And I know that there's some communication that came from the Health Department Senior Deputy Commissioner Cox Kane to OMES, where she had said how we declined to pursue this. So I think in the past, there's been a relationship, I imagine, where this could have been declined. Since my time there, I don't exactly understand the relationship, because there are a lot of things that are rather nebulous about it because of the fact that maybe the management of the relationship and the budgetary facets that need to be put into place to be able to determine whether or not projects can be paid for, the ability to examine whether or not the deliverables you received really exist, all those kinds of things, ongoing maintenance costs, all those kinds of things are obviously things that would require a lot of project management from the business side at the Department of Health, and I don't see that that's happened at all.
Okay. And I believe you provided documentation talking about on your timeline. Forgive me, I can't find it at the moment. When was the first time that the Board of Health was notified about these problems? I know you had a couple meetings with them, obviously without having a quorum on several of the meetings, but what was the first date that you had a conversation with the Board of Health on these issues?
Well, I think it was really explicitly stated at the August 12th Board of Health retreat at OSU Stillwater. That was a Saturday. I believe that was the first time, and really I was just called upon by Senior Deputy Commissioner Cox Kane while she was giving a presentation, and I took the liberty to respond, as I've been told, in a very long-winded fashion. So I did that in there. Several weeks passed before we got to the October 3rd Tri-Board Board of Health meeting, and where I said it again, things that I spoke about previously in the executive committee. And obviously it wasn't until the 18th that I was able to meet off site with 3 board members, and that was organized by Mr. Brian Downs, who is our was our legislative and policy person at the time that kind of marshaled that group up. So nobody was they weren't contacting back or anything.
So during that couple weeks time after you shared this information, no board members reached out to you to clarify exactly what you had said during this Board of Health meeting?
Not to me.
Not.
I don't know what other communications were had. I think we were still kind of under the previous platform where the CFO was nobody. So I don't know if there had been other communications. I was surprised that nobody, was making contact with me, but nobody particularly made contact with me.
Okay. Just to pivot real quick, and I won't take much longer, I promise. Obviously, I think it was last week that OSDH released the corrective action report. I would imagine that you were fairly influential in some of the portions of that corrective action report, and that you had input. Is that correct?
Yes, I did.
In your opinion, are there issues or things within that corrective action report that were not included that should be included to put the agency on a better path?
I think the things that were discussed in there, if they're executed, will put the agency on a better path. I think the things that we discussed today, some of them were not particularly put into that report, probably because of the detail level of that report. It's very difficult to understand. I think in keeping with the discussions today, as far as the things in that report, those are the things that are needed for the Department of Health to be able to operate correctly and within the boundaries of the funding that it receives.
We've been told since we started this Special Investigative Committee that through things like the corrective action report and through new leadership, that the culture has begun to change. Would you agree with that statement, that the culture has changed within OSDH? And if not, what else could be done to ensure that it does?
I would agree that it's a more transparent culture. I think somebody had spoken earlier about having, some type of other, objective means of communication for various oversight, like accountability systems maybe should have been and I don't know what that would look like in the future. I mean, I think that if agencies are able to have a cash flow vehicle like what the Department of Health still has, right, without the controls in place that are being forced by me, I mean, it would appear to me, I don't think it's illogical to infer from that somebody else in the future could come along and do the same thing. So I think that's probably a fairly big issue. I think as far as being able to, for employees to be able to speak their mind. I mean, I know, there's a statute there at Title 74 about whistleblowing and the ability for employees to do that, but I don't think there's enough teeth there for employees, longtime state employees, to really be protected and insulated from bringing something like this to the surface. I think that you have some protections there. In other words, that maybe you could utilize if you were involved in a lawsuit, but it doesn't appear that there's a way that employees, if they do feel oppressed in an environment like that, would really have the ability as public servants within this system to be able to come forward and say, this is a problem, and I am insulated from the potential repercussions of bringing that forth. I mean, this happened because somebody that was not a longtime state employee that really has nothing to lose and doesn't care because they're going to do the right thing was there. You get a longtime state employee and it's going to be a lot more difficult, right? Sure. So I don't know what that looks like for you all, but I think that's probably something to examine.
We've asked you a lot of questions here today, and you've shared a lot of information. Is there anything additional that you wish to share with the committee on any point that we may not have touched on?
No, I think you touched on. Huh? Yeah, this is just on stuff they want to touch on. I'll let you choose. I don't think there's anything particularly, I think the big points are there, and the most important thing that I want to make sure of that comes away from this is, I think, to dispel the remainder of the doubt about whether or not do we have funds that have been stolen or kited or abused to a point where they can never be figured out what this $30 million is and so forth, and what did it go for, and were people taking trips or partying on this? I mean, these are, like I said, perfectly traceable within the Department of Health's financial ledger system, and as that supplemental appropriation is utilized, it will be utilized appropriately to correct those areas where borrowing within a fund occurred because of over expenditure for delivery of the public health items that were delivered. So, the problem is this occurred because of the way the system is set up, and that $30 million was a pretty good guess on what needed to be done to right the agency. But all that happened was a line of credit was taken because there was over expenditure.
Very good. Well, once again, we appreciate you being here. Would you like to provide any closing statement at this time?
I'd like to just simply thank the committee for being so polite and helpful, because this is a very complex process and a lot of complex items to discuss, and I appreciate the courtesy and respect that everybody showed me. I want to also thank those people at the agency that have worked extremely hard and not gotten the credit for all of the hard work that they've done. Respect and admire them for the work that they do for the state of Oklahoma, as I do this body and all those that do this work. It's very complex. It's not easy, and public servants deserve a lot of credit for what they do. And this is one of my first forays, the first foray into state government, and maybe I'll never return after this, but I must say I do respect these people for working very hard, and I thank you wholeheartedly for the job that you do. I believe my attorney has one item of clarification.
And Mr. Chair, this is in response to a question asked by Representative Calvey on contact with law enforcement. Mr. Romero's response would not include any contact with any ongoing or possible criminal investigations that are ongoing. We would not want to compromise the integrity of those processes, and just want to make it clear to the committee that those we cannot talk about those right now. And I would hope nobody would want us to talk about them in this setting.
Thank you very much for the clarification. At this time, Mr. Romero, I will potentially be in contact for, as Representative Calvi said, if there's additional documentation requested by the committee, we'll continue to work through that. But we do appreciate your willingness to be here today, and at this time, you are dismissed. Members of the committee, I will announce follow-up meetings in the near future. So stay tuned, and I will keep you advised on future meetings. At this time, seeing no further business, we'll stand adjourned.